This is Pawsitively Sabotaged, Book 1.5 in the Witch of Edgehill series. The story takes place between Pawsitively Poisonous and Pawsitively Cursed. It's written by Erin Jackson and narrated by Victoria Villarreal. Chapter 1. The pungent scent of citrus wood oil filled Amber's nostrils as she wiped down another shelf. She hadn't been sleeping well lately, and had started coming downstairs in the wee hours to clean when her mind wouldn't settle enough to let her rest. The shelves had been scrubbed to shining just a few days ago, though. Perhaps she could start alphabetizing items by color. What she really needed to do was replenish some of her toy inventory. The cats were always her most popular item, naturally. One would expect nothing less in Edgehill, her beloved cat-obsessed town. But a small band of children on a field trip had recently raided her stash of safari animals. Getting the spell work just right for the elephants was an easy favorite for her. It took a lot of delicate fine-tuning to make sure the sound that erupted from their plastic trunks resembled a trumpet, not a foghorn. It was a little sad that no one but her knew the toys in her shop that moved and acted like real animals by way of voice activation were really powered by spells. It was Amber's way of using her magic, keeping the skill toned and strong, like a muscle, while also keeping it a secret. A knock sounded on the glass door of her shop and she jumped, accidentally giving her bottle of orange-scented wood oil a squeeze. A stream of it splattered on the floor. She craned her neck, hoping she wouldn't find Chief Brown waiting there. They were both actively avoiding each other, so it seemed unlikely. Still, it was too early in the morning to deal with the likes of him. But it was Betty Harris, her across-the-way shop neighbor, who stood in the recessed alcove of the quirky Whisker's doorstep. Amber set her rag and bottle of oil down, then hurried to the door. What on earth was Betty doing here at 7 in the morning? As Amber unlocked the door and pulled it open, the bell above it jangled. "Hey, Betty." Opening the door wide, she stepped aside and gestured the woman in. Betty was an African-American woman in her 60s who owned Purrfectly Scrumptious across the street. She sold the best cupcakes in town, hands down. Just before Betty crossed the threshold, her shop cat, Savannah, bustled in. The fluffy white and gray Maine Coon strutted into Amber's shop as if she owned the place. Though, to be fair, Savannah strutted everywhere she went. Amber kept a small bowl of cat treats behind the counter, as well as a dish of water. This wasn't Savannah's first rodeo, so with only a little chirp of acknowledgement to Amber, the cat strode across the shop and behind the counter. "Hey, Sugar," Betty said. Amber secretly loved that Betty called her Sugar, since Betty was a cupcake baker who permanently smelled like sugar and had a deep fondness for the stuff. Betty said, "Sorry to bother you so early, but I wanted to ask you something." Amber's brows furrowed as she took in Betty's pinched expression and the way she lightly wrung her hands. "What's wrong?" "Did you see or hear anything odd at my shop last night?" Amber, unlike Betty, lived in the same building where she worked. The quirky Whisker, Amber's curiosity shop, took up the bottom floor, while Amber lived in the small studio apartment on the second floor with her 2 cats, Tom and Allie. From the seat of her window bench, she could easily see Purrfectly Scrumptious below, as well as a good portion of Russian Blue Avenue, where both shops resided. "Sorry, no," Amber said. "I was tossing and turning for most of the night, too. What kind of odd are we talking about?" "Well, I landed a pretty significant job a couple of months ago. The Graham and Holt wedding." Amber, as reclusive as she could be, had actually heard about the Graham and Holt wedding. The bride-to-be, Darby Graham, had visited the feline-obsessed town of Edgehill a few years ago, and being a lover of cats herself, had wanted to hold her wedding here ever since. Nigel Holt was the heir to a massive fortune connected to the hospitality industry. The Holts were hoity-toity, so they had deep pockets. Vying for parts in this wedding as a vendor had been a cutthroat affair, at least from what Amber had learned indirectly from her friend Kimberly Jones. Kim worked at a bank, making her chances of being involved with the wedding slim, so she lived vicariously through everyone else. She was exceedingly gregarious, and had kept Amber informed about the various complaints sweeping through town about Darby being a Bridezilla. Kim had even attempted to convince Amber to throw her hat in the ring, but it had quickly become clear that the likes of Darby Graham would have no use for the curiosities in Amber's shop with a wedding this fancy. Connor Declan, an acquaintance of Amber's, had written an article in the Edgehill Gazette a week or so ago about the wedding and the business it was slated to bring to Edgehill. Letty Rodriguez from Angora Threads and her child prodigy son, Diego, had been hired to custom-make Darby's wedding gown. Grace Williams from His and Hers, who was a genius at crafting vintage-looking works of art from repurposed materials, was making the centerpieces. The flower arrangements would regrettably come from Edgehill's rival town of Marble Glen, but no event was without its flaws. The article touched on Darby's past, practically painting her as a pauper marrying a prince. Darby hadn't come from a moneyed family, at least not when compared to the Holts, but she was apparently taking her responsibility as a future member of hotel royalty very seriously. Everything down to the last detail had to be perfect. As much of a nightmare as the woman had been purported to be, though, Amber thought it was pretty cool she was making it as much a celebration of Edgehill as her pending nuptials. Amber loved that her quirky little town could have that effect on people. Though Edgehill was far from posh, it was just kitschy and unique enough that it appealed to people from all walks of life. Landing a gig for the wedding was a big deal. Amber hadn't known Betty had been selected for it, and she felt a little hurt now that this was the first time she'd heard about it. But Amber chalked that up to her own reclusive ways more than Betty keeping it a secret. "Did Darby hire you to make their cake?" Amber asked now. "A cupcake tower, yes," Betty said. "A 5-tier cupcake tower with some of the most elaborate fondant work I've ever had to do. I've had to do so much experimenting. Bobby says I mutter about CMC powder and gum paste in my sleep." Amber bobbed her head as if she'd understood what any of that meant. She had no idea what it entailed to make baked treats. She just knew how to eat them. "I've been putting in some really long hours in the shop trying to get this order ready. Darby has changed her mind about the design, the flavor of cake, and the color scheme multiple times already. The woman is driving me nuts, honestly. But the wedding is in less than a week. I just have to get through these last few days," Betty said. "Anyway, I've been getting in around 4 a.m. every morning to get my usual supply made for the day before working on Darby's order until the shop opens. This morning, my cupcake freezers were unplugged. A pound of salt had been poured into my last batch of buttercream frosting, and 3 dozen cupcakes with the most elaborate fondant work had all been smashed, and all the fondant figures. Some of them took hours to make. It's as if someone picked them all up one by one, squeezed them in their fists, and dropped the mess to the floor." "What kind of monster defiles cupcakes?" Amber asked, frowning. "Was anything taken? Money or equipment or anything?" Shaking her head, Betty said, "Nope. I forgot to clear the money out of the till last night, and it's all still in there. No windows were smashed. I have a couple of very high-end tabletop appliances in that kitchen, and none of those were taken. Whoever it was came in the back. Kicked the door in. The wood around the lock is splintered. The door was ajar when I got in this morning." "Gosh, Betty, I'm really sorry. Did you call the police?" "Yeah, someone is on the way," Betty said. "I just wanted to check in with you since you were across the street. I hoped you might have heard something." "I wish I had. I only got a few hours of sleep last night. Maybe they vandalized the place in the short window of time I'd managed to doze off." "Okay, thanks," Betty sighed. "I have a final taste test scheduled with Darby tomorrow, and now I have nothing to show for it." "Do you have enough time to remake the samples?" "I think so. It'll be tight, but I should be able to manage. Who needs sleep anyway, right?" She chuckled, but sobered quickly. "We just let our part-time employee go, too." Amber knew that Betty's daughter had been helping in the shop as much as she could until 7 or 8 months ago. Her daughter had moved out of state when her husband had landed a dream job opportunity. Betty and Bobby had been struggling a bit since then, without reliable help. "Why do you have to let your employee go?" Betty wrinkled her nose. "Bobby and I couldn't ever prove it, but we think the girl was skimming money out of the till. At the end of the month, our books weren't balancing properly. She showed up late often, too. Caught her playing on her phone when she was supposed to be cleaning. Things like that. I don't want to hover. Micromanaging her felt like another job." Amber had been gently suggesting to Betty for a while that she needed to hire more consistent help. She and her husband Bobby did the lion's share of the work and ran the business efficiently. But Purrfectly Scrumptious got busier and busier every year as word of mouth about Betty's incredible cupcakes spread to more and more people. Every year during the annual Here and Meow Festival, Betty had to hire temporary workers for the weekend-long hoopla because they often had a line out the door all festival long. Amber supposed when one's livelihood was on the line, they'd prefer to work their fingers to the bone and get the work done well and correctly on their own, rather than relying on strangers, especially when those strangers were deceitful or unenthusiastic about the work. Amber had 2 part-time employees herself, a pair of sisters. If you'd like to borrow Daisy and or Lily this week to help take a load off, I'm sure they'd be happy to help. They're very reliable and are comfortable with the register. Betty nodded. Thanks, sugar. I might have to take you up on that. I don't know anything about your former employee, Amber said slowly. But do you think there's any way she could have broken in and ruined the cupcakes despite you? This is going to sound terrible, but I'm not sure if that girl is ambitious enough to pull something like this off. Often 10 a.m. was too early for her, and she'd roll in for her shift 10 minutes late. Though I suppose she could be a night owl who's up until 2 in the morning. Amber shrugged. Might be something worth mentioning to the police. Good idea, Betty said. Well, I've got some more buttercream and batter to make. Thanks for the chat. Let me know if you think of anything, okay? I will. And if you need help over there, let me know. Betty smiled tightly. Come on, Savannah. I need you to be my lookout while I work. If the criminal comes back, you bite their ankles like you do to me when you think your dinner hasn't been served on time. Savannah came trotting out from behind the counter, licking her lips. Amber had no doubt the cat had just cleaned her out. As Betty and Savannah crossed the street, Amber stood in the doorway of her own shop, watching them go. Betty was easily one of Amber's favorite people in town. The idea that someone had broken into her shop, regardless of the reason, ruffled her feathers. Amber had been across the street, yet had heard nothing. It left her unsettled. But what would she have done if she had heard something? Amber and Betty had exchanged a set of keys for their respective shops a while ago in case of an emergency. Amber had never needed to use them. She couldn't say she'd have been brave enough to put the keys to use last night. The fact that it didn't seem like a run-of-the-mill robbery only unsettled her more. Had this been a personal attack? Did this individual plan to come back? And if they did, would it be with intent more violent and smashing a few cupcakes? Chapter 2. Huddled behind her counter so no one in her town full of magicless residents could see, Amber balanced the welcome sign from her shop's front door on her knees. Currently, the small chalkboard sign sported her top hat-wearing, bespectacled cat logo. 2 digits of his pawed hand clutched the brim of his hat, which he tipped toward his audience. The words, "We're open," were written in a looping, cheery yellow cursive font. Changing the sign was one of her favorite daily rituals to flex her magic muscles. With a quickly uttered spell and the wave of her hand over the top of the board, her cat logo now had his eyes closed and wore a striped sleeping cap on his head, complete with a puffy ball of cotton on the end. The message now read, "Taking a quick cat nap. We'll reopen at 12:30. Amber had ordered and received a large pepperoni pizza a few minutes before. In a feat of dexterity that impressed even herself, she got the newly designed sign on the door, herself and the pizza box out the door, and locked, all without dropping her lunch. She bustled across the street where she knew Betty was sure to still be working, even though she'd put up her out to lunch sign 5 minutes ago. When she knocked on the door, it was Bobby who answered. He grinned at her as she hustled inside, his white teeth in sharp contrast to his dark skin. "Hi, Amber. How you doing?" "I've come bearing gifts because your wife is probably refusing to take a break." Bobby laughed. "Stubborn as a mule, that woman." From behind the swinging door that led into the kitchen came a shouted, "I heard that!" Amber winced, but Bobby was still smiling. "And the ears of a bat," he whispered. "I heard that too." Bobby only smiled wider. "I'm glad you stopped by. I was going to get us some lunch, but now that you're here, I think I'll run to the hardware store instead.
Gotta get that back door patched up before we close tonight."
Amber frowned. "I'm really sorry you have to deal with that."
"Been here for years and never had a problem," Bobby said. "Don't know if it's a good sign or a bad one that something like this is just happening now."
"I doubt this is a sign that Edgehill is suddenly becoming unsafe," Amber said, hoping that was true. "Have you heard of anyone else on this street who was targeted?"
"Nope. But the police are staying tight-lipped about it. Well, mostly. The officers sent out were Carl and Garcia. One talks too much and the other one not enough."
Amber chuckled. That was an apt description. She had to admit she had a soft spot for Carl. He was young and eager, like a golden retriever. Some found Carl's exuberance tiresome, but Amber liked seeing someone excited about their job. It said a lot, though she wasn't sure what, that everyone referred to Carl by his first name, while all the other officers and Chief Brown went by their surname. Maybe Carl just hadn't earned his stripes yet.
"Anyway, good to see you, Amber. I should head out to that store before we have to open again,"
Bobby said, giving her a quick squeeze on the shoulder.
"Bye, babe. Call me if you think of anything else we might need."
"I will. Love you," Betty called from the back.
"Love you too."
And then he was gone. Amber deposited the pizza on the counter. "I've got food, Betty. Have any plates?" Purrfectly Scrumptious, as always, smelled of sugar and vanilla. The countertops were pink granite, and the floors were made of shiny white tile. The accents, the cabinets, light fixtures, and the trim around the doors and windows were light pink. Large glass-enclosed cases displayed the treats of the day, the walls inside the cases decorated with pink and gray silhouettes of cats. Normally, Amber would prefer much less pink in an establishment, but Betty had made the shop homey rather than garish. Despite having a very large pizza in her possession, Amber was eyeing the tray of coconut cream delight cupcakes. Those were legendary in Edgehill. Amber didn't even like coconut, but if she'd found out there was only one coconut cream delight left on this earth, she'd elbow a child in the nose to get it. Amber often mused that it would make perfect sense to her if she learned one day that Betty was a kitchen witch, like Amber's Aunt Gretchen. Betty's baking skills were magical. The swinging door to the left of the cupcake display opened and out walked Betty, looking even more worn out than she had this morning. She carried 2 small cake plates and some napkins. After handing them to Amber, she untied her apron strings and pulled the loop over her head. Small splatters of flour had still made it onto her navy blue top. "Thanks for the food," Betty said, her stomach growling audibly. Amber chuckled and plated 2 slices for Betty. By the time Amber had fixed her own plate and closed the box, Betty had already scarfed down half a slice. A little dribble of orange-colored grease tracked down her chin. It wasn't until Betty had eaten 2 more slices and a little life had returned to her tired expression that Amber addressed the elephant in the room. "What did the police say about the break-in?" "Not much. They took photographs and asked me a bunch of questions, including if we have security cameras." Betty frowned, wiping her napkin across her chin, which came away with a streak of orange. "We don't, of course. Never thought we'd need such a thing. The shops on either side of us don't have cameras either." Amber shook her head. "Me either." "They dusted for fingerprints. Bobby and I will have to go down to the station this week to give fingerprint samples so they can run a comparison and eliminate ours," Betty said. "There was a partial footprint in the mess the burglar left on the floor. They took photographs of that too. They said I probably wouldn't have an update for several days. Fingerprint scans don't happen in minutes like they do on television," Carl said. I bet he sounded disappointed when he said it too. Betty chuckled, but it was half-hearted. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said, though. About our old employee. I still don't think it was her. But we were in steep competition with Kathy Mulgrew over at Kat's Treats for the Graham and Holt wedding. Kathy was not happy when Darby chose us over her." Amber's eyebrows hiked. "Did she threaten you or anything?" No, nothing like that. Darby called me one day, saying she wanted me to try one more request. She had a fondant figure she wanted, as well as more cake flavors,
and essentially gave me 24-hour notice to make a trio of cupcakes with strict parameters. She claimed she wanted to see what I could produce under pressure, just in case something catastrophic happened close to her wedding and I had to scramble to make replacement cupcakes. I met her at the Manx Hotel in one of the conference rooms. "Can I just say this is stressing me out and I don't even have to participate?" Amber asked. "You see why I've turned into an insomniac. I have dreams about her calling me with a cupcake emergency and I lurch awake in a panic about modeling chocolate." Amber tucked her lips under her teeth to keep from laughing. With a knowing smile, Betty said, "During the entire time I was auditioning and bending over backward to comply with whatever new challenge Darby threw at me, I thought I was the only one in the running. But that day she called me to the Manx, I found out Darby had been putting Kathy Mulgrew through the same process. It wasn't until that day that I found out I had competition. I thought the job was mine as long as I kept doing whatever Darby asked." "And Kathy thought the same thing?" Amber guessed. "Right. We both thought we were shoo-ins for it because she'd never mentioned that she was auditioning anyone else," Betty said. "After I presented my cupcakes to her, she asked me to wait in an adjoining conference room. Who do you think was already waiting inside?" "No." "Yes. Kathy was shocked to see me. I was shocked to see her. We got to talking and realized what was going on. After an agonizing 10 minutes, Darby came in with a woman and a man, introducing them as her accountant and her wedding planner, respectively. Then, like we were on the set of a reality show, Darby turned to me and said, 'Betty, I'm delighted to inform you that I have chosen you to make my wedding cupcakes.' To Kathy, she said, 'Kathy, I'm sorry, but your cupcakes didn't make the cut. June has a consolation check for you. I appreciate your time.' June was the accountant. She pulled a check out of a folder and slid it across the table. Kathy was so confused at first that she just picked up the check and stared at it. When she burst into tears, the wedding planner helped escort her out. I really didn't know then if Kathy was crying out of sadness, relief, anger, or all three." "Oh my gosh," Amber said, eyes wide. "What a terrible way to break the news." "I'm not sure if it could have been worse," Betty agreed. "And then sometime after that, Kathy lashed out at you?" Amber asked. Betty tottered her head from side to side. "It's been more passive-aggressive than that. She's been in here dozens of times since then, always when it's busy, and orders cupcakes she knows we're out of or running low on. Or she'll stand in the back and loudly complain the service is too slow. While I'm ringing her up, she'll make comments about how I would have a better stocked shop if I wasn't trying to burn the candle at both ends, and that taking the Graham and Holt job is clearly cutting into my business. She even knew about the employee I had to fire. She just keeps pushing my buttons. Maybe she wants me to crack so she can snatch the job out from under me." "Yikes," Amber muttered. "Do you think she'd resort to breaking in here and ruining your cupcakes and fondant figures? Is there any way she knows that you're bringing the final selections to Darby tomorrow?" Betty shrugged helplessly. "I really don't know. Darby brought Kathy to the edge of insanity with the audition rigmarole, then shoved her off when she rejected her. I can't blame Kathy for going a little nutty, but I'd hope she wouldn't be so callous as to vandalize my shop. Haven't seen her in almost 2 weeks, though. Figured she gave up. I was starting to think she sent someone else in her place, actually. A bearded man I've never seen before has been in here several times this week during peak busy hours and only buys something occasionally. But he stopped coming in a few days ago, too. I'm probably just paranoid now." Amber thought about that for a while. She honestly couldn't fathom how Kat's treats had even made it to the final round, when Purrfectly Scrumptious was the superior choice, without question. "I might be biased, but Kathy's cupcakes are nowhere near as good as yours." Betty managed a small smile. "What she lacks in baking. She excels in fondant work, though. Some of her cakes are absolute works of art."
Sure, but they're supposed to be works of art you can also eat, that you want to eat. Hers aren't any better than what you can find at a grocery store, Amber said, meaning every word. You're the whole package. Betty sniffled. I appreciate that. I'm just nervous about doing a good job. I love what I do. I really do. I feel most myself when I'm baking, or when I see people's eyes light up when they take a bite of something I've made. I live for that, truly. But I feel out of my depth here. Darby is so demanding. I know I'm good at what I do, but what if I'm not good enough? The money we'll get from this job will help pay for some much-needed repairs. We bought a new cupcake freezer and an oven not that long ago, so the budget has felt a little tight lately. This could be so good for us in the short run, but it could help in the long run, too. Bobby thinks having this wedding under my belt will convince me to finally enter the Best of Edgehill competition in a few months. Amber was on the Hear and Meow committee and would help oversee the entrance in this year's hairball, the biggest fundraiser event for the festival, where the Best of Edgehill competition was the star of the event. You totally should. You and these cupcakes are destined for great things. Don't let Kathy's bitter attitude make you second-guess yourself. I'm trying. Some days are just harder than others. Being sleep-deprived doesn't help. It definitely doesn't. And neither does someone violating your space, Amber said. Okay, it's decided. The Bowen sisters are coming in for their shifts after lunch, and I'll send one of them over to help you. Betty started to protest, but Amber cut her off. Nope, no arguing. You have fondant and gum glue or whatever to make. Let them help you, okay? I'm sure Bobby would be happy to give them a crash course on how to run the counter. Betty huffed out a dramatic sigh. Thanks, sugar. They ate a few more pieces of lukewarm pizza and chatted about nothing in particular. Savannah wandered out to join them. She'd clearly just woken up from a nap. She flounced into a rare patch of February sunshine, warming the tile, and rolled onto her back, eyes closed. Oh, to be a cat, Betty mused. Cats don't develop stress ulcers, I can tell you that much. Amber thought of her own cat, Tom, who feared his own shadow. That poor guy probably had a few stress ulcers. Her other cat, Allie, did not. She was the type of cat who knocked things off high surfaces just to see what would happen. That or some part of her chaos-loving soul just liked the sound of destruction. As Amber left Betty's shop to return to her own, she thought about Savannah lying in the sun without a care in the world. While most cats didn't bother with anything as tiresome as stress, they were all prone to curiosity. And, much like a cat, Amber was going to let her curiosity guide her. She would cut out a little early, leave one of the Bowens in charge, and purchase a mediocre cupcake from Cat's Treats. If someone was harassing Betty, Amber planned to get to the bottom of it. Chapter 3. Edgehill was positioned between Marble Glen to the north and Belhaven to the south. Cat's Treats was in an area of town near the border between Edgehill and Belhaven, in what most people considered the shadier part of town. Several businesses had folded over the last several years and had never been taken over by new owners. Houses were more run down, and lawns were surrounded by sagging chain-link fences. There was a bar on the border of the two towns called the Sippin' Siamese that was always packed, but other businesses in the area either thrived or crashed and burned, not much in between. Amber guessed Cat's Treats was near the latter end of that spectrum. The rent, Amber suspected, was more affordable in this area, but it meant foot traffic would be hit and miss. Even so, Cat's Treats sat on Color Point Road, which was a busy thoroughfare, if only because it eventually intersected with Korat Road, a two-lane highway that connected Belhaven to Edgehill. If someone had been on a long drive and ended up in Edgehill, Color Point Road immediately offered a gas station, a couple of restaurants, and Cat's Treats. It wasn't a heart-of-town location, so much as a location that catered to travelers on their way to or from somewhere else. Cupcakes at Cat's Treats were, in Amber's opinion, an impulse buy, while Purrfectly Scrumptious was a planned destination. After parking in a free public lot beside a diner, Amber walked over to Cat's Treats. Several cars whizzed past her, heading for Korat Road, tires splashing through shallow rain puddles dotting the asphalt. Though it wasn't dark enough yet for the neon lights from the Sippin' Siamese's sign to be burning bright, she thought she could make out the edge of it looming in the distance. As much as Amber had disparaged Kat's treats, when she made it to the shop, she stopped dead outside the window display, her mouth slightly agape. She admittedly hadn't been here in a few years, but hadn't remembered this. Betty was right. These cakes were works of art. The theme of the display was springtime, making Amber wonder if Kathy also planned to try her hand at the Best of Edgehill competition. Springtime was the theme for this year's hairball as well. From strings of various lengths hung several white bird cages festooned with fake moss, vines, and colorful flowers. Tightly packed balls of silk hydrangeas in bright white, blush rose, and soft baby blue hung among the cages. Butterflies and dragonflies with wings made of silk or paper perched on the strings, flowers, and cages. On the ground sat potted ferns, faux marble stands dotted with baskets, and ceramic vases overflowing with roses and lilies. Strings of plastic vines covered with bright pink flowers were draped over stands and vases, adding even more color to the vibrant display. Mixed among the flowers and cages were Kathy's cakes. In a cage hung close to the window, its wire door standing open, rested a round cake covered in fondant flowers, dragonflies, and intricately painted vines. A basket lined with a bed of plastic grass contained cupcakes, topped with things like bunnies holding carrots, brightly colored birdhouses, red-capped mushrooms dotted with yellow spots, and dozing cats. The longer Amber stared at the display, the more she spotted hidden desserts, their designs so elaborate and realistic that it was hard to believe they were made from sugar, water, and corn syrup. It started to rain again while Amber loitered outside, so she finally tore her gaze away from the display and hurried inside the shop. A couple stood at the counter paying for their order. Kathy was behind the register, dutifully answering the flurry of questions from the man, who was mostly gushing about how impressed he was with her talent for manipulating sugar.
"I don't think I can eat any of these," the man was saying, laughing. "They're too pretty."
Kathy leaned toward the couple conspiratorially, and they mirrored her.
"If we're being honest, most fondant tastes terrible. For the sake of time, many bakers use commercially made fondant. I try to make and use marshmallow fondant as much as time allows, just because it does taste better. The ladybug cupcakes you got have mostly marshmallow fondant."
"Cool," the woman said.
"I can't wait to try these."
These turned out to be 24 cupcakes. While Kathy got the plethora of them loaded into giant pink boxes, Amber milled about. The shop sat about 10 people, yet only 2 of the sunshine yellow tables and matching chairs were currently occupied. Carefully peeled off fondant lay on napkins in front of the pair of women in the corner, with wadded up cupcake wrappers discarded on their plates. The 2 ladies left while Kathy was still boxing up the order. "I think I liked the design of the cupcakes better than the cupcakes themselves," one lady whispered to the other as they passed behind Amber. "Yeah, I agree. The red velvet one was a little dry," the second one said. "But the little fondant red dragon on it is so cute. I'm taking it home to show Abby. Maybe I can freeze it." Seemed that not much had changed in Kat's treats since the last time Amber had been here. Though Kathy had an artistic eye, there wasn't anything particularly awe-inspiring about the decor of the store itself. The floor was black and white checkered tile, and the counter that ran along almost the entire length of the small shop was white, with 2 cutouts in the front for display purposes. The counter was topped with a row of 5 blocks of glass-fronted shelves. A freestanding refrigerated case sat along a side wall where larger cakes were stored. Behind the counter hung a large chalkboard with the day's specials on it, along with several chalk-drawn cupcakes decorating the edges. On either side of the board hung black and white framed signs. One said, "All you need is love and a cupcake," while the other declared, "Life is short, eat dessert first." The place was clean and no frills, save for the elaborate window display. But as Amber approached the far end of the counter, peering in at the gorgeous offerings arranged by flavors and themes, she understood that there was no need for decorations on the walls. The cupcakes were the stars of the show. Amber had grown very enamored of a cupcake topped by a gray mouse with wide ears. Amber's Aunt Gretchen called her Little Mouse. A wedge of orange cheese sat in front of the mouse's feet. "Hi, can I help you?" She glanced up to find Kathy smiling at her from behind the counter, though her smile was strained. The couple, with their 2 giant cupcake boxes, had already slipped out into the rain. "I would love the mouse cupcake." "He's one of my favorites," Kathy said, then slid open a door on her side and plucked the cupcake from the tray, where it had been hanging out between a hedgehog and a hamster. By the time Amber had convinced herself she didn't need the hedgehog too, Kathy was already behind the cash register. The price of the cupcake was exorbitant, especially since she knew the flavor of the cake wouldn't compare to one of Betty's. As Kathy placed the treat in a single cake box, Amber asked, "How long does a fondant figure take you to make?" "Oh, it depends on the size and complexity of the figure, but this little guy," she said, gently tapping the pink box, "took about an hour." "Wow, that's a long time for just one cupcake," Amber said. "I consider it practice for when I have bigger jobs, birthday cakes mostly. Parents want to go all out for their kids' first birthdays even if the kid won't remember it. My cakes are very photogenic." "Do you do weddings too?" "Yep. Anniversaries, baby showers." "Have you heard about the Graham and Holt wedding? It's all the buzz in town. I bet people like that would pay a small fortune for one of your pretty cakes." The sound of crunching cardboard pulled Amber's gaze to the counter, where Kathy's fist had inadvertently smashed Amber's cupcake. She gasped, an irrational part of her thinking, "Oh no, you just killed my mouse," before remembering that it was made of sugar, not flesh and fur. "Oh, goodness," Kathy said, snapping out of whatever dark place Amber's question had sent her into. "I'm so sorry." Kathy carefully peeled open the box, but the cake was smashed, and the mouse had been decapitated. Amber frowned at the mouse, fighting the urge to apologize to it. Tears instantly welled in Kathy's eyes. "You buffoon!" Amber's head reared back slightly, as if she'd been slapped. Kathy wasn't looking at her, but at some distant place only she could see. Kathy gently tapped the side of her fist on the counter. "Buffoon!" Tap. "Buffoon!" Tap. I'm sorry if something I said upset you." That seemed to snap Kathy out of it again, and her eyes lost that glazed-over look. Finally, looking up at Amber, Kathy sighed heavily and swiped a wayward, frizzy brown curl out of her face. "Sorry about that. It's been a hard week." The woman didn't look disheveled exactly, but she wasn't quite put together either. Now that Amber was paying more attention to her than the cakes, she noted that the woman's forehead was shiny, as if she'd worked up a sweat just before Amber had arrived. Her black apron was dusted with flour, and the V-neck shirt beneath it was more of a U-neck, as if it either hadn't been washed in a while or had been washed too much. Her brown hair was liberally streaked with gray, and the black scrunchie holding her hair back from her face looked like it had come from another era. A rosy hue colored her cheeks. Amber wondered if the woman was sick. Or was she recovering from a long night of breaking and entering? Did she feel guilty about what she'd done, and was unraveling now? "I almost had that job," Kathy finally said. "The Graham Holt wedding, I mean." "Almost?" Kathy nodded, the threat of tears suddenly gone. In fact, she'd sobered completely in the face of this topic shift. "At first, I thought it would have been a great gig for me. Good for exposure and all that. But the bride-to-be ultimately wanted to work with someone who was less ornate than me and a bit more unvarnished, if you know what I mean." Amber didn't know what she meant, but she felt offended on Betty's behalf. She resisted the urge to rub a handful of the dry chocolate cake into Kathy's face. "Someone with a more down-home appeal, you know? Plus, even as well off as the Holts are, I don't think they could afford my prices. I don't come cheap, and my cakes are highly sought after. I've gotten better about only working with clients who understand my worth as an artist and who won't question my vision.
Power to whoever got the job when I said no. They're going to have their work cut out for them.
It always amazed Amber when a person could lie that easily. But perhaps Kathy had been working on that lie for a while, telling it to herself over and over until she believed that she'd turned Darby down, not the other way around. Maybe it was a defense mechanism. Amber didn't think that was the whole story, though. If Kathy had just needed a lie to tell herself to get over the pain and embarrassment of losing the job, she wouldn't be popping into Betty's shop multiple times to passive-aggressively harass her. Kathy said,
"Please choose another cupcake since I ruined yours. Anyone you like."
Amber really didn't want another one, but it would be odd to leave here empty-handed, especially since she'd already paid the ludicrous price for the one with the now decapitated mouse. She peered in at the other small animals that adorned the cakes in front of her.
"I have a whole spring-themed section over there," Kathy said. "Most of the cakes are carrot cake or white cake, and I made all the insect toppers with marshmallow fondant. They're quite tasty. There are some with edible wafer paper butterflies as well."
Amber glanced up as Kathy headed for the other side of the counter and cocked her head as she noticed Kathy walking with a limp. "Are you okay? Are you injured? Perhaps when you kicked in Betty's back door last night?" By the time Amber met Kathy on the side of the counter with the butterfly-bedecked cakes, an unmistakable sheen of sweat coated Kathy's face, and her cheeks had gone even rosier.
"I broke my ankle almost 2 weeks ago. Fell off a curb. Stupidest thing," Kathy said, leaning heavily on the counter. "I'm not supposed to be on it at all, but I'm short-staffed today because my regular employee is sick. My daughter went into labor this afternoon, 3 weeks early. Her husband is out of town on a work trip, so my husband, who usually runs this place with me, had to drive her to Bellhaven. I've been on my own here since noon. It's taking a toll." She winced. "Do you mind if I sit down?"
She dropped out of sight behind a display before Amber could reply. Amber peered around the shelving on the counter to find Kathy seated on a low stool. One foot stuck out. A foot that was encased in a cast. It was also velcroed into some kind of boot. This explained why she looked a mess. She was in pain and probably exhausted. And if she'd had a broken ankle for over a week, she couldn't have been the one who kicked in Betty's door last night. It also explained why Betty hadn't seen Kathy in a while. "Do you have crutches or anything?" Amber asked.
"I have one of those knee scooter things in the back. It's hard to maneuver behind the counter with it. I kept crashing into cabinets. I had a crutch until about an hour ago. It was resting against a wall and it fell behind a piece of furniture. I've been hobbling around ever since."
Amber sighed heavily. "Want me to fish it out for you?" Kathy's eyes welled with tears again.
"I would really appreciate it. I'll throw in an extra cupcake for free."
It took about 10 minutes for Amber to find the wayward crutch and get it unstuck. Once she was sure Kathy could get herself around the shop after Amber left, she picked out 2 cupcakes she didn't want. "I hope you have a better night," Amber said as she headed for the door. "And congratulations on the grandchild." Kathy sniffed and raised the hand that wasn't keeping her crutch in place. Amber was fairly certain the woman started crying just as Amber slipped outside into the rain. When Amber was back home in her little studio, she placed the cupcakes on the counter. One was dotted with purple wafer butterflies, and the other was covered in white and yellow fondant flowers, one of which was topped with an intricately crafted bumblebee. Tom and Allie sat side by side on her bed, watching. "Which one do you think I should try first?" she asked, holding a cupcake in either hand and describing each to the cats. Allie mewed when Amber said the word bee, so she opted for that one. After carefully peeling off the layer of fondant and placing it on a paper towel, Amber took a generous bite of the white cake. It tasted fine. Bland, but fine. Perfectly acceptable. She eyed her cats. "We can cross Kathy off the list of break-in suspects." Allie licked her paw, then swiped it over her ear. Allie rarely cared about Amber's investigations. Tom hopped off the bed with a muted thud and wandered over to his food bowl, letting Amber know he cared even less about her investigation than Allie did. Despite her audience's lack of interest, she soldiered on. She eyed the remainder of the cupcake in her hand. The only crime Kathy has committed is charging $7.50 for a cupcake. In case Amber missed the memo about him wanting dinner, Tom yowled as if his limbs were being ripped from his body. Amber nodded. I'm glad you agree. Chapter 4. The next morning, Amber stood at the front door of the Quirky Whisker and called Betty. She answered almost right away. This downpour is something else. Amber knew Betty was bustling about in her shop already, but the rain was falling in such a heavy sheet, she hadn't risked going over to chat with her in person. There had been nearly white-out levels of rain for the past half hour, but she could make out Betty's dark shape behind her own shop door across the street. She told Betty about her conversation with Kathy the day before. I didn't realize I'd hired you to be my private investigator, Betty said. You can pay me in cupcakes. Betty laughed. I actually wanted to ask you something. When Betty was quiet for a smidge too long, Amber asked, What is it? This is a little silly, but would you come with me to meet with Darby later for the final taste test? Betty asked. I didn't sleep very well again last night, so I'm on my 4th cup of coffee and I feel a little jittery. I'm not sure I trust myself to drive. Bobby's going to hold down the fort, and Daisy's scheduled to come in after lunch. Happy to reimburse you for gas. Sure. Lily can manage this afternoon for a few hours. I rarely get too busy on days it's raining this hard anyway. I really appreciate it. My appointment with her is at 12:30 at the Manx Hotel. Sounds good. I'll take a chocolate surprise in lieu of gas money. Betty snorted. You got it. The Manx Hotel was the fanciest establishment in Edgehill, so Amber supposed it made sense that Darby Graham had made the place her base of operations. It resembled a sprawling Victorian-era mansion, more than one of the posh high-rise buildings that bore the surname of Darby's husband-to-be. The facade was a soft brown with striking black accents. Scattered around the property were elegant black cat statues, several of which were perched like gargoyles on the corners of the roofs. The walls and floors of the lobby were made of rich, dark wood, their surfaces gleaming. A wide staircase rose behind the C-shaped registration desk, sitting squarely in the middle of the spacious room. A doorway bookended either side of the lobby, leading into lounges. Far down the hallway to her left was the sliver of a swanky bar. Betty held her cupcake tray tight. Whether to still her jittery hands or her jittery nerves, Amber couldn't say. She'd been tense during the entire car ride. A young man was the only person behind the reception desk. He smiled warmly at them each in turn, but his gaze rested on Betty. Mrs. Harris, correct? Miss Darby is waiting for you. He hiked his nose a little higher in the air as he regarded Amber. And you are? She's with me, Betty said. The young man pursed his lips. Let me just check with Miss Darby. He vacated his post without another word and walked briskly through the open doorway to the right of the lobby. Amber huddled closer to Betty and lowered her voice. Are you okay? I'm so caffeinated, I think I can taste colors. Amber barked a laugh that startled a woman coming down the grand staircase. Amber winced and mouthed an apology. To Betty, she said, That is alarming. What cupcakes did you bring for Miss Darby to try today? I have churro, berry mascarpone, maple bacon, and banana cream. Amber's mouth watered. She hadn't eaten lunch yet, and Betty's payment of chocolate surprise was still in the car. I'll eat the leftovers of whatever she doesn't like. I recommend the churro ones. They're the freshest. The cake on that one is plain vanilla, so it's the easiest to make. Those were baking while I made the frosting for all the others this morning, Betty said, talking faster than usual. She was going to need to flush that caffeine out of her system sooner rather than later. I made the rest the day before the break-in. They're one of the few things that survived the vandalism, actually. The cord to the cupcake freezer was cut, but the cupcakes inside were still okay. It's our smaller, older freezer, and the door sticks something awful. That door saved their little sugary lives. I've had to remake everything else. Amber was less concerned about the cupcakes and more concerned about the state of the freezer. They cut the cord instead of just unplugging it? Betty sighed. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't just a clean slice. They removed a chunk of it and cut off the plug for the outlet. Thankfully, the bigger, newer freezer is huge and harder to move, so the plug was left alone other than getting pulled out of the wall. We've got someone coming out today to look at the ruined freezer to see what we can do to get it fixed. It's not just a matter of replacing the power cord. The whole back of the freezer has to be removed to get to the wiring. We really can't afford to spring for another freezer right now. Amber wanted to wring this mystery person's neck for causing the Harrises so much trouble. Betty had been beginning to crack even before the break-in. Hopefully, Miss Darby was in an agreeable mood, because if she gave Betty grief too, Amber was likely to go into full mother-hen mode. She might have been the reclusive odd duck in town, but Betty was on her very short list of friends. Betty was good about checking on Amber periodically. She dragged her to community events. Even when Amber was being prickly and antisocial, Betty never gave up on her. No one messed with Betty. Amber wouldn't stand for it. The young man returned. When he smiled at them, the professional warmth was aimed at Amber, too. If you would follow me, ladies. He turned on the heel of his shiny shoe and headed back the way he'd come. They'd walked across a lounge area full of expensive-looking sofas and low wooden tables. A large flat-screen TV sat on an elegant cherry wood credenza. A man wearing a vibrant Hawaiian shirt sat in a recliner aimed at the TV, where a golf tournament played. He was fast asleep with his hands folded on his chest and his head tipped toward the ceiling. Amber could detect his snore from halfway across the room. She couldn't blame him. She didn't like golf either. Their guide led them into a long hallway lined with closed doors. He stopped outside one with a gold 2 hanging from the wood. You will be in conference room 2 today, Mrs. Harris. He swung the door open with a flourish. Inside, several people were already waiting. Though Amber had only seen one picture of Darby Graham in that article in the Edgehill Gazette, and it had been a black and white picture in profile, Amber instantly recognized her. She was in her mid-20s, thin and willowy, and had her glossy black hair up in a high ponytail. She stood in a corner, having what appeared to be a heated conversation with an older woman. Mother? Mother-in-law? Darby glanced over just as the door closed behind Amber and Betty. She broke off her conversation and strode over, much to the annoyance of the older lady if the crossed arms and tight jaw were anything to go by. I'm so glad you're here, Darby told Betty, a hand on either of her upper arms since Betty's hands were still firmly grasping her cupcake carrier. She had a very slight Midwestern accent. I've been raving about your cakes to everyone I meet. I know I've put you through a lot this week, but if you weren't so good at what you do, I wouldn't be having such a hard time choosing flavors. Betty, despite her exhaustion, beamed at the praise. I'm happy to hear that, and I do hope you'll like the flavors I brought today. I only brought 2 of each, though. I didn't realize you'd have company. Oh, don't worry about that. We'll cut them into wedges. Here, let me introduce you. Darby turned to address the 4 others in the room. Everyone, this is Betty Harris, who I've been telling you about. Her shop is called Purrfectly Scrumptious. Isn't that darling? Darby's assembled guests muttered half-hearted agreement. As she introduced each person to Betty, the person raised a hand as if Darby were a teacher calling roll. We have William, Nigel's younger brother, Nigel's mom Candace, my mom Trudy, and my best friend and maid of honor Robin. Candace had been the woman Darby had been chatting/arguing with when Amber and Betty had first walked in. Nigel wanted to be here too, but he's been at his bachelor party in Aspen and they got snowed in. He'll hopefully be here by tomorrow. I hope. Still so much to do. Darby punctuated that with a slightly hysterical giggle. Amber mentally winced. Come, let's try these no doubt beautiful and delicious cupcakes, Darby said, gesturing Betty to the table. Amber slunk into a seat near the end of the table, there only as moral support. Darby's guests took seats on one side of the table, while Darby and Betty stayed on the other. Darby cooed and clapped when Betty removed the lid of the container. The others leaned forward at the sight of Betty's cupcakes, each one prettier than the last. As Darby unstacked the pile of waiting cake plates in the center of the table, Betty cut the first pair of churro cupcakes into small wedges while explaining the flavor and ingredients. She then waited patiently while the group sampled the treat, discussing the merits. Betty stood with her hands behind her back, her expression blank save for the occasional tick of her jaw. On and on this went through each one. William, Nigel's younger brother, looked miserable to be at this function. Amber wondered why he wasn't in Aspen with his brother. Was he not in the wedding party? Though he seemed to enjoy eating the cupcake samples, the rest of the time he sat slouched in his chair with his arms crossed, or scratching absently at his beard. Every time he started fussing with it, Candace would gently slap his hand away, as if he were a misbehaving toddler. Darby acted as Betty's waitress, collecting plates, passing out napkins, and helping Betty hand out each new cupcake offering to her guests. By the time they'd reached the third one, though, Darby had become fidgety. She coughed awkwardly several times during Betty's description of the maple bacon cupcake, apologizing and waving off concerned questions from her maid of honor, Robin. A healthy, possibly alarming shade of pink had crept up Darby's neck as well, which she scratched at periodically. "There aren't any walnuts in these, are there?" Darby's mother, Trudy, asked. "No, ma'am. I have Darby's list of allergens, and I've tailored all the recipes based on that list. For the past 2 months, I've discontinued making my popular coffee walnut cupcakes to ensure there isn't any cross-contamination." "I'm fine, Mom," Darby said, but she didn't look fine. She dutifully handed out the slivers of the final cupcake, this one the banana cream. Before Darby had a chance to pick up her own cake sample, though, she sucked in a wheezy breath. Darby swayed. Trudy lurched to her feet. Robin called Darby's name. Darby dropped out of view below the table. Those who hadn't been standing were now. By the time Amber had run over to them, Betty had Darby's head in her lap. Robin vaulted across the table, like a cop in an action flick sliding across the hood of a car, knocked over a chair, and landed deftly by Darby's side. She jabbed an EpiPen into Darby's thigh, right through Darby's designer jeans, and depressed the plunger. The room filled with a flurry of voices. Amber repeatedly asked what had happened. Betty kept telling Darby to breathe, and Robin told Darby to squeeze her hand. Darby's mother had a phone pressed to her ear, calling for an ambulance. From what Amber could tell, Candace, Darby's mother-in-law, was on the phone with Nigel, frantically telling him that his fiancé was suffering from an allergic reaction. The only one who remained unmoving was William. His wide-eyed expression implied he was too shocked to know how to react. He idly scratched at his beard. Amber was at a loss about what to do too, rooted in place. She'd never seen someone have such an intense food reaction before. Robin and Betty murmured to Darby, telling her help was on the way and to breathe slowly. Though her gasps had calmed somewhat, Darby was taking in wheezy breaths, like a fish on land. Amber knew the only help she could offer was via magic. Since everyone was occupied, she slightly turned her back, kept her head low, and whispered the words for an air spell. It was one she'd tried time and again to add to her animated bird and dragon toys. She hadn't been able to perfect the flight spells that needed to be infused into the plastic discs, but she'd gotten good at casting a basic air spell, thanks to all her trial and error with the more complicated spellwork. As always, Amber imagined her magic like tendrils of blue smoke. She cast that invisible smoke toward Darby, pushing the gentle breeze across her face. Amber guided the air into her nostrils and down her throat, imagining her magic forming a mask over Darby's face, supplying extra oxygen to her taxed lungs and tight esophagus. Darby coughed, sucked in a deep breath, then let it out shakily. "Good girl," Robin said, brushing sweat-dampened hair out of her friend's face. Darby's head was still in Betty's lap. Red bumps dotted Darby's arms, neck, and face. Hives, Amber guessed. "Just keep taking slow, steady breaths, hun," Betty said. "You're breathing better already." "No thanks to you," Robin muttered. Betty reared back a fraction. "This wasn't my doing. I'm diligent when it comes to my clients' food allergies. I guarantee you there were no walnuts in those cupcakes." "The ambulance is on the way." Trudy marched around the conference table, practically knocking Amber aside. With her hands on her hips, Trudy glared down at Betty. "So are the police. I'm going to want a full investigation into what happened here. If you're not as careful as you claim to be, and my daughter's anaphylaxis is a result of you being careless, you can bet your behind there will be a lawsuit." Amber spoke up. "Betty isn't careless. If she said there weren't any walnuts in those cupcakes, then there weren't. Trudy took a step back, eyeing Amber curiously as if she hadn't realized Amber had been standing a foot away from her and had instead magically sprouted from the ground. She gave Amber an appraising scan from head to foot. I don't even know who you are. Before Amber could reply, the door to the conference room burst open. Amber and Betty scuttled to a far corner to get out of the paramedics' way. In record time, Darby was on a stretcher and being wheeled out. Robin, tears in her eyes, followed. Across the room, Candace took Trudy by the hands. You go too. Be with your girl. She'll want her mother when she wakes up. William and I will stay here and talk to the police when they arrive. We'll make sure those two talk to the police as well. Candace jabbed a finger in Amber and Betty's direction. Thank you, Trudy said, hugging Candace, then squeezing William's forearm. She snatched up her purse and jacket from a chair and hurried to the door, shooting a death glare at Amber and Betty in turn as she went by. A low, pitiful noise came from Betty, like a balloon slowly losing air. Amber wondered if she even knew she was making the sound. They had their arms linked. Amber couldn't remember when they'd done that. She felt as if Betty needed something solid to hold on to, otherwise she'd crumble to the floor. Amber knew there was no way Betty had done this. She might have been sleep-deprived and jittery, but not to the point she'd accidentally poison a client. But she also knew Betty would be second-guessing herself, worried she had messed up somewhere. And now Trudy Graham, with the help of the very wealthy Holtz, no doubt, was going to sue her into the next century, and she'd lose her beloved business. Amber knew these things were going through Betty's head, because if the roles were reversed, they're the worries that would plague her right now. Amber squeezed Betty's arm a little tighter. Within 10 minutes, Carl and Garcia showed up. Edgehill's police force was too small for cops to go out on calls with a partner, assuming having a partner wasn't just an invention of Hollywood. But since Carl was still so new to the force, she guessed he often got paired up with other cops for extra training. That, or Chief Brown wanted him out of the office to get a break from his endless enthusiasm. Carl saw Amber and Betty first. He strolled over.
Oh, wow! Hello again, Miss Blackwood. How'd you get caught up in another investigation so soon?
Good question. Melanie's murder case had only been wrapped up a week ago.
I'll go speak to the other two,
was all Garcia said before he strode off.
He'd never admit it,
Carl said, leaning in.
But he's a pretty fun guy to hang out with. We sang Bohemian Rhapsody all the way here. He's got a wicked falsetto.
Amber and Betty swung their wide-eyed gazes toward the nearly mute Garcia. There's no way.
So, can you ladies tell me what happened?
Carl asked. Amber let Betty tell the story, only adding in extra details when necessary, since Amber had had a different vantage point of the incident. While Betty recounted the tale, Amber watched as Garcia bagged up the uneaten wedge of banana cream cupcake that Darby hadn't had the chance to try. The other cupcakes had been fully consumed, but Garcia clearly intended to take the plates, forks, and Betty's cupcake tote with him. Amber had no idea if it was possible to acquire a toxicology report from the analysis of food, but there was little chance Edgehill's little force would have the resources for that. She imagined the cupcake wedge getting bundled into a chilled container, like an organ needed for a transplant, and being shipped to a testing facility in Portland, Seattle, or beyond on a private helicopter owned by the Holtz. Am I under arrest? Betty asked. Carl cocked his head at her, making him resemble his puppy persona even more.
No, ma'am. We don't even know if a crime has been committed here. We're just gathering information is all. If we have any more questions, we'll contact you. Just don't flee the country or anything.
He chuckled at his own joke, but Betty only managed a strained smile. Garcia joined them then.
Can you grab my kit out of the car, Carl?
Carl nodded at Amber and Betty, then loped out of the conference room. Amber eyed Garcia, his expression as stoic as ever. Wicked falsetto my foot, she thought. That was an even more impossible notion than Betty having poisoned Darby Graham on purpose.
We'll be in contact if we need to ask any follow-up questions, Garcia said. Just so you know, Mrs. Harris, if it's determined that Miss Graham suffered anaphylactic shock because of one of your cupcakes, we may need to investigate your bakery. The families might push for that, regardless."
Amber and Betty glanced around Garcia to find Candace across the room, her phone to her ear as she glared their way. Garcia lowered his voice and said,
"It may be in your best interest to contact Chief Brown and permit him to conduct a search as soon as possible. If you're seen as cooperating with the investigation, it will look better for you. Nip this in the bud. We would do our best to get it done quickly so it doesn't impact your business too much."
Amber warmed to Garcia even more. His gut, whether it was police spidey senses or from knowing Betty for years, was telling him what happened to Darby hadn't been intentional. Not on Betty's part, anyway. But Amber also didn't doubt that if the police somehow uncovered incriminating evidence at Purrfectly Scrumptious, Garcia would arrest Betty himself even if he felt bad about it. He was a good guy and a good cop, and apparently also a good singer. She still couldn't believe it. "Thank you," Betty said. "I'll contact him soon. I have nothing to hide." With a nod, he headed back toward Candace and William. "Let's get out of here," Amber said, gently tugging Betty to the door. Carl, loaded down with a large black bag slung over his shoulder, gave them a salute as he bustled past them in the lounge. The man who had been sleeping so soundly in front of the golf channel was gone. She imagined the excitement of a stretcher being rolled through would have woken anyone. When Amber and Betty finally closed themselves in Amber's car, Betty let out a very distressing sound that was part sigh, part sob. "I'm going to call Chief Brown." Amber started up her car and headed back for Russian Blue Avenue. By the time they made it across town, a police cruiser was parked in front of Betty's shop, and Chief Brown himself was chatting with Bobby as Savannah alternated between rubbing against each man's ankles. One glance over at Amber's car, and suddenly Chief Brown was guiding Bobby inside the cupcake shop. Amber and Chief Brown had never been, and would never be, romantically involved. He was married, had a young son, and a second child was on the way. Not to mention the fact that neither one was remotely interested in the other. No, their relationship was much more complicated than that. Up until a month ago, they'd had an antagonistic relationship. Now he was ignoring her entirely. She wasn't sure this recent development was any better than the previous one. "Thanks again for coming with me," Betty said, refocusing Amber's attention. "I'd be even more of a wreck than I already am had I gone through all of that alone." "No problem. Call me if you need anything, or if you hear anything about Darby's condition, or if you want to give me a second-by-second play-by-play of everything that happens during the search because I'm incredibly nosy." Betty laughed. "Sure thing, sugar." Amber watched as Betty hurried across the street to her shop and disappeared inside. She sent a silent prayer into the universe that Darby came out of this relatively unscathed. Not only for Darby's sake, but Betty's. Chapter 5. Amber had just flipped the open sign to closed at the end of the day when her cell phone rang. It took her several long seconds to find it, creeping around her shop trying to track the sound down before the call went to voicemail, and Amber lost track of the dang thing again until she got another rare phone call. She found it behind the counter beside a box of small plastic bags she used to package up her loose-leaf tea blends. "Hello?" she asked in a rush, fumbling so frantically to get the call answered that she didn't register who the caller was. "Oh my God, Amber, hi!" Amber sagged and sat on the floor behind the counter, the apothecary wall to her back. She crossed her feet at the ankles. "Hi, Kim." "What on earth is happening in your neck of the woods today?" Kim asked. Amber and Kim had been mere acquaintances in high school. They'd known of each other, because small town, but hadn't run in the same circles. Mostly because Amber's circle consisted almost entirely of her younger sister, Willow. Her parents had nailed the concept of keep your magic a secret at all costs so firmly into Amber's head that it made her leery of forming close friendships, for fear of revealing her secret by accident. Willow had been good at keeping her own magic a secret and maintaining a healthy social life. When their parents passed away in a fire during Amber's senior year in high school, Amber retreated into herself even more. Kim, like Willow, had always flourished socially. But Kim was also a lot. She spoke in an excited, breathy way, regardless of the subject matter. One either found Kim a delightful ball of endless energy or exhausting. The two had been thrown together after their mutual friend, Melanie Cole, had been murdered via poison a month ago. They'd bonded over their shared grief. Kim, glomming onto Amber, had initially rankled Amber's reclusive feathers, but she was warming up to Kim more and more. Kim was good at wearing a person down with her relentless, overbearing charm.
Dina down at the Catty Melt heard from Sally Laurel's husband, Maurice, that Betty Harris got so upset with Darby the Bridezilla that she shoved a cupcake so far down her throat that she asphyxiated, and you held Darby down.
Amber snorted. Have you ever seen Betty lose her temper? Remember 2 years ago when we had the tea party-themed hairball and Betty made that elaborate teapot-shaped cake?
Oh my God, Amber, Kim said, laughing. I forgot about that. I can still hear the thunk of old drunk Harvey Matthews face planting right in the middle of that cake within minutes of it being rolled out.
We all lost our minds, but Betty kept her cool. She'd worked on that cake for hours. She deals with entitled, rude customers every week. Why do you think a few demands from a Bridezilla would turn her into a feral cat?
I don't know,
Kim moaned pitifully.
I just keep hearing about how awful that lady is. Maybe I liked the idea that the person who finally snapped and gave her the what for would be Betty.
There was no force-feeding of cupcakes, and I certainly didn't enable such a thing. And, for the record, Darby's not that bad.
This is all quite disappointing.
I'm sorry we're not more bloodthirsty.
You and me both, Kim said. So what happened?
When Amber finished recounting the story, Kim was silent for a few seconds.
Oh, dang it. Now I feel bad for Darby. Do you think something was in those cupcakes that she's allergic to and didn't know it? I can't imagine Betty would have messed up like that.
I can't either, Amber said. I suppose Darby could have eaten something or been in contact with something long before she ate any of the cupcakes, and her allergic reaction was delayed. But I keep thinking about something Betty said earlier.
What's that?
Betty said that 3 of the 4 cupcake samples she brought today were made 2 days ago, the day of the break-in. The vandal had destroyed all the cakes in Betty's bigger freezer, but the cakes in the smaller one had been left alone. Betty thinks it's because the door on that freezer sticks, so maybe the vandal resorted to cutting up the power cord when they couldn't get the freezer open.
The same vandal who kicked in the shop's back door like a bad butt?
Bad butt?
I do my best not to curse,
Kim said a bit defensively, as if she expected Amber to protest. Well, this vandal's bad butt status got me thinking. What if they destroyed all the stuff in the kitchen, not just to vandalize the place, but to do something to those cupcakes? Amber asked. Maybe the vandalism was a cover for what the person actually broke in to do. Kim gasped.
Oh my God, Amber. You think someone knew about Betty's sample cupcake meeting with Darby and broke in to sabotage the cupcakes?
Amber shrugged, even though Kim couldn't see it. Maybe. It's the only thing that makes sense.
You think this was attempted murder?
The implications of this theory were sending the already dramatic Kim toward an even higher tier of drama. Amber hoped her relaxed tone would help mellow Kim out. Darby is allergic to walnuts. You'd think she would have noticed sooner if there were chunks of walnuts in the cupcakes.
What if it was finely chopped walnuts sprinkled on the frosting?
Betty said she made all the frosting this morning.
Seems like it would be really hard to stuff a bunch of walnuts, finely chopped or not, into frosting-free cupcakes without Betty knowing they'd been contaminated, don't you think? Kim asked. Not that I'm doubting Betty.
You're just doubting my theory, Amber said. Kim laughed.
It might need a little work. I'm digging how your sleuthing skills are developing, though. It's just unfortunate that it's because Edgehill might be going to heck in a handbasket, what with all the murder, attempted or otherwise.
They fell silent again. I hope Darby is okay, Amber said softly. Hearing her gasping for air was awful. Thankfully, her friend was ready with that EpiPen.
I've got a friend who's a nurse at Edgehill General. I'll check if she knows anything and call you back if I get the skinny.
Kim ended the call before Amber could reply. Her friend might be worried about Edgehill going to heck, but whether or not she wanted to admit it, Kim got a thrill of trying to unravel a mystery. Amber wasn't sure if she personally got a thrill out of it, but the disconnected pieces nagged at her, urging her to get them into a logical order. An odd sound emanated from her front door, and she started. Brow creased, she propped herself up on her knees and peered over the counter. A man stood outside her door, hands cupped around his eyes as he peered into her shop. Though it was still light out, the dim lighting of the recessed entryway and the baseball cap pulled down low on his forehead made it impossible for her to make out his features from this distance. There was something familiar about him, but she couldn't place him. She debated opening the door to inform him what time she opened in the morning, but something about him gave her pause. The sign on the door clearly stated that the shop was closed.
"It's only 6, came the man's muffled voice. "How is this place closed already? Everything is closed. This town is the worst."
Amber stayed put. The man took a step back and gave his robust beard a scratch. 2 greasy, half-moon-shaped marks marred the glass where the edges of his palms had been resting. Suddenly, he vanished from sight as he bent down. Amber hoped the man wasn't so enraged that he was now searching for a projectile to hurl through her window. A few moments later, he stood to full height with a hand wrapped around an item in a brown paper bag. When he brought it to his face and tipped his head back, Amber figured it was a bottle or can of something alcoholic. After a long swig, he backed up several more steps, shouting his displeasure once again that the shop was closed so early. He stalked down the sidewalk. As he passed by the window, Amber craned her neck and peered around the objects stacked on her counter so she could watch him go. She decided the man wasn't as familiar as she originally thought. Something about him, though. The beard, his voice, his gait, niggled at her. Sighing, she resumed her earlier position behind the counter with her back to the apothecary wall and her legs stretched out in front of her, feet crossed at her ankles. It wouldn't be the first time a tourist was miffed about the fact that shops, especially in off-season months, closed much earlier than was customary in larger cities. One of her feet lightly tapped against the other. Tom was no doubt furious she hadn't fed him his dinner. But she wasn't ready to go upstairs just yet. Her conversation with Kim had pulled all of Amber's lingering questions about Darby back to the forefront of her mind. Before she realized she'd made the decision, she'd scrolled through her recent calls list, selected a number near the top, and pressed the phone back to her ear. She remained sitting on the floor.
"Hello, Amber."
"Why do you sound so skeptical already?"
"I woke up from a nap a few minutes ago," her Aunt Gretchen said, "and I'd been having a very distressing dream about you."
"Anything I should be worried about?"
"I'm not sure yet."
"Well, that's ominous. Did it have anything to do with poisoned desserts?" Amber's gaze shifted toward her front door. "Or bearded men?" Her aunt was quiet for a beat.
"It did not. Is that why you're calling?"
Amber eyed the plethora of loose tea-making supplies under her counter. Since Amber had spent most of her life not using her magic, she had no idea what her specialty would have been had she trained in the discipline since she was a child. Affinity for certain magic types materialized on its own, of course. Whether it meant cooking a gourmet meal or potent tinctures, Amber had never been particularly skilled in the kitchen. Aunt G was, though. She felt as at home in a kitchen surrounded by herbs and spices as she did in a garden, her knees and hands stained brown from rich soil. Amber's younger sister leaned heavily in the kitchen witch direction. Amber, especially after stumbling through magical solutions to uncover who had killed her friend Melanie a few weeks ago, wasn't sure where her affinity lay. "Do you know much about food allergies?" Amber asked now, then explained Betty and Darby's current plight.
"Interesting," Aunt G said. "Do you know how food allergies work?"
"Vaguely." Darby has an immune system that labels proteins in walnuts as harmful. There are some spices, as they come from similar sources, that share proteins with tree nuts and can cause cross-reactivity. I make tinctures for a young lady in my apartment complex, but because she has a rather severe peanut allergy, she told me that any tinctures I make for her cannot contain cumin, as there are often trace amounts of peanuts in the spice. I went on a rather extensive deep dive into plant proteins and spices after talking to her. Fascinating stuff. Yeah, Amber was not predisposed to being a kitchen witch. I can hear you rolling your eyes at your nerdy old aunt, Aunt G said. You're not that old. Aunt G gasped in mock offense. The sound of flipping pages came over the line. Ah, here. Okay, so I have a list of tree nuts and the type of spices that can cause cross-reactivity. For walnuts, the one that's most likely to cause an allergic reaction is sesame. Even though sesame seeds were small, and their white color could have easily blended into a vanilla cake or been hidden in banana cream, it still seemed like painstaking work to get sesame seeds into the cakes. It was highly unlikely that Betty wouldn't have noticed they'd been tampered with. Not to mention, one of the 5 people sampling the cupcakes would have noticed if small, hard seeds were in their bites of soft, moist cake. Amber gasped, sitting up a little straighter. Isn't sesame seed oil a thing? Could someone have somehow swapped out Betty's oil without her knowing? I doubt it. For one, logistically, it would mean someone broke in stealthily and swapped out her oils and left no trace they'd been there, and broke in a second time to vandalize the place in a very destructive manner 2 days later, Aunt G said. Seems like a convoluted plan. Secondly, sesame seed oil can be used in baking, but because it has a very nutty flavor and aroma, if it was sneaked into Betty's usual oils, she would have noticed. It would have overpowered the other flavors in the cakes as well, especially if it was accidentally used in high quantities. It probably would have tasted burnt, because sesame has one of the lowest flash points of all the cooking oils. Amber sagged. I do wonder, though, if it might have been added after they were baked, Aunt G said slowly. A needle puncture in the soft cake top wouldn't be noticeable if someone had injected the oil. A little added to each one would have had 2 days to soak into the cake, and the fresh, richly flavored frosting Betty topped each cake with could have masked the nutty scent of the oil. Devious. Let's say our theory is right, Amber said. It would have to be someone close to Darby to know sesame oil could cause an allergic reaction. The potential severity of Darby's allergies was bad enough that Robin knew exactly where to find the EpiPen and what to do with it. Which probably means something like this has happened before, Aunt G said. Seems like anyone in that room could have known about the allergy. How many of them are familiar with Edgehill itself? They'd have to know where Purrfectly Scrumptious was. Is most of the wedding party in town for the wedding by now? The groom-to-be and his groomsmen are still in Aspen, Amber said. So that rules out half of the wedding party. Amber wondered once again why William, Nigel Holt's younger brother, was in Edgehill attending things like cupcake tastings instead of being in Aspen with his brother. Perhaps William hated snow. Perhaps animosity brewed between the brothers. Aunt G offered several hmms as she contemplated all this. It's a very curious mystery. Good thing you're not a detective, isn't it? Mm-hmm, Amber said absently. Your magic almost got you into trouble with the police chief last week, Aunt G said sternly, making Amber feel like a teenager again instead of a 30-something woman. She was the only family member left who could make Amber feel that way. That trouble may still come to pass. If you're going to meddle in this on Betty's behalf, at least be smart about it. Amber bristled. It's not like I plan to throw fireballs around. And it's not like I was flaunting my magic last week. It was a case of bad timing." Aunt G gusted a sigh. "I'm sorry, little mouse. That dream just had me rattled, I guess. Anyway, I should go. I have dinner plans." "Oh?" Amber asked, drawing the word out. "What kind of plans?" "I just told you. Dinner." "Yes, but romantic plans? Or platonic plans?" Aunt G grumbled something. "Sorry, what was that?" "I said they're somewhere in between." Amber gasped. "How could you keep the details of maybe romantic plans from me? Does Willow know?" Aunt G grumbled again, and Amber grinned. Her aunt had stepped up to be their guardian when the sisters' parents had passed. She'd given up her life back in Seattle without complaint, taking on the responsibility of 2 grieving young women. She'd raised Amber and Willow as if they were her own, and the sisters had never felt unloved. But Aunt G wasn't a touchy-feely kind of person. While she'd hold them while they cried over a broken heart, she wouldn't necessarily have the words to make them feel better. She would, however, find a way to get itching tonic into a cheating teenage boy's gym clothes and cause him to be sent to the nurse for a day. Amber and Willow lived for any opportunity to embarrass their aunt when it came to softer emotions. "Willow does not know," Aunt G said evenly. "And I would appreciate—" "What are you going to wear? Since Willow doesn't live that far from you, I'm sure she'd be happy to come do your makeup." "Don't you dare." Amber mock gasped this time. "Is this the 3rd date? Is this why it's maybe romantic? You're trying to decide if this is the night. Hubba hubba." "You are awful." "Wear that forest green dress you got last year when you were in town. It makes the gold flecks in your eyes pop. Once he sees you in that thing, he won't be able to keep his paws off you." Aunt G was silent for a moment. In a quiet voice, she said, "Thank you. That's a good suggestion. I would like to be pawed, I think. He's got hands the size of dinner plates." Amber's mouth dropped open. "Hubba hubba indeed," Aunt G said. The call disconnected. Chapter 6. The rumor mill was in full swing by morning. The quirky whisker flooded with nosy residents pretending to be interested in Amber's wares, when they were actually interested in getting the skinny on what had happened to Darby Graham yesterday. Daisy Bowen had been helping across the street, but by late morning, Betty had sent her back due to non-existent customers. While Amber doubted anyone in town who knew Betty thought the woman had purposely poisoned Darby, they weren't taking any chances either. Even blue-eyed Savannah strutting and rolling around outside the bakery's door couldn't draw people into the cupcake shop as she usually did. At closing, Amber had just ushered her last customer. Reed, nosy shop neighbor from down the street, out the door and locked it when Betty came bustling over. Amber quickly unlocked the door and yanked it back open. The bell above it clanged. Betty rushed in with Savannah hot on her heels. "Darby isn't dead," Betty said in a rush, then bent over, hands on her knees. "Ooh, sugar," she said to the floor. "I was worried my cupcakes had killed her." Amber placed one hand on Betty's back and the other on her elbow, guiding her behind the counter and onto a stool. Savannah had her whole fluffy head buried in the glass treat bowl, not even glancing up to make sure Betty was okay. Typical cat. Squatting in front of Betty with a hand on either of her knees, Amber asked, "How'd you find out?" Betty had her eyes closed and was taking in long, slow breaths through her nose. At least she wasn't doubled over anymore. After a few moments, she opened her eyes. "Garcia called with a follow-up question, but I think it was partly to let me know Darby pulled through. She's covered in hives, though, and they're probably going to postpone the wedding." "Yikes, what a mess," Amber said. "It seems so expensive to have to move it back." "Apparently, Darby's hives are pretty bad. They're all over her neck and face, which, even with copious makeup, isn't ideal for wedding photos," Betty said. Amber winced. "I guess not. But if it's a choice of hives or being alive, I'd choose being alive. Betty offered a semi-hysterical laugh. The poor woman was losing it. Have you been sleeping? Amber asked. She shook her head. Not much. Well, now that you know Darby is more or less okay, maybe you can get some rest, Betty stared at Amber for a beat. What if this destroys my reputation? Won't happen, Amber said. People avoided my shop for a while, too. Being accused of murder will do that. You're only being accused of attempted murder, so the customers will come back to you sooner than they did to me. Welcome to the Social Outcasts Club. That earned her another semi-crazed laugh. All right, Amber said, helping Betty to her feet. They ambled to the door. Bobby still over there? You have a safe way to get home, right? But by the time they reached the front door of the Quirky Whisker, Amber could already see Bobby bustling about in the shop across the way. He was likely giving the place a good scrub. He glanced over just as Amber's door opened. Savannah zipped past them like a shot. You all right, babe? Bobby called across the deserted street. She's okay, Amber called back. She just needs to sleep. Get your butt over here, woman. I've been trying to get you to rest more all week. If you don't argue, I'll order takeout and draw you a bath. Ooh, you better accept that offer, Betty, Amber said, giving her a gentle nudge across the street. Amber stood on the curb and watched Betty slip into the space between Bobby's outstretched arm and his side. She looped an arm around his waist, and he kissed her on the temple. They both turned to wave at Amber before they disappeared inside their shop, Savannah darting in just before the door closed. Trying to ignore her little pang of jealousy, she ducked back into her shop. 3 days later, on the day that the Graham Holt wedding had originally been scheduled, Amber was enjoying a lazy Sunday in her apartment. The Quirky Whisker opened at 10:30 a.m. on Sundays, so, much like a cat, she lounged on her bench seat in the brief patch of sunlight streaming through the gray clouds. Tom was curled up in her lap. Allie was sprawled out by her feet, and Amber was enjoying one of her specialty cups of hot chocolate. The whipped cream sprinkled with cayenne pepper had already melted into the decadent drink, giving each sip a hint of heat, both in temperature and spice. She'd just left her dozing cats on the bench seat and deposited her mug in the sink when her landline rang. She had a visceral reaction to the sound. The last time someone had called her on that, it had come with the news that Melanie had died. Hello? She asked cautiously. Hi, sugar. I tried calling your cell phone, but it kept going right to voicemail. Amber sighed to herself. She had forgotten to charge it again, and now that its ring couldn't alert her to its new hiding place, she'd need to conduct a locator spell to find it. What's up? Are you up for a meeting with Darby? Amber cocked her head. A meeting? She's working to get the wedding rescheduled for next week. It sounds like ointment would be enough to treat the hives, but she's been so stressed about the wedding that the doctor thinks a few days of forced bed rest would help her mentally. I don't know if it still counts as bed rest if you're working from the bed. Okay, but why would I be invited? I'm not part of the wedding. She'd like one of your animated toys, Betty said. Well, she has a niece who's got a birthday coming up, and she'd like one of the toys. She's turning 8 and loves animals. The more unique, the better. Darby laid on the guilt real thick, saying that one of your toys would brighten her day. I told her I'd ask you. Amber had 2 toys in mind. She'd just finished a sloth a couple of days ago. It had taken months of spell tweaking to get it just right, as all her movement spells weren't quite slow enough for the sloth. If it moved too slowly, however, it tended to fall over, as if it had just croaked on the spot. That was not ideal for a child's toy. She'd grown so fond of it, she'd considered keeping it for herself. There was a second unique toy that might just fit the bill, though. I have the perfect one I can bring. Betty heaved a relieved sigh. Excellent. I can drive you this time. I've been sleeping for nearly 9 hours every night. I feel like a new woman. On the way to the Manx Hotel, Betty informed Amber that Darby was conducting meetings all day in half-hour increments. Amber wondered if a gaggle of wedding party members would be in the room as well. A memory of Robin from the day of the cupcake tasting flashed through her mind. Robin had looked like she would have shanked Betty with a cake fork had the woman not already been so worried about the state of her friend. Amber hoped Robin was elsewhere today. The same young man who had escorted them to the conference room a few days ago was there to usher them to Darby's room this time, but his demeanor was frosty toward them both. Rumors spread fast in Edgehill, so it didn't surprise Amber that he'd already heard something about this whole fiasco and had taken sides. Clearly, his was the Betty poisons her difficult clients side. Darby was staying in a suite on the 3rd floor, in a unit that was 3 times the size of Amber's studio apartment. A man who might have been an honest-to-God butler answered after Betty rapped her knuckles against the wooden door. He was armed with a clipboard and a sour expression. After checking their names on the list, he motioned them inside.
"Miss Graham, your 10 a.m. is here," the man called out.
"Thank you, Renly," came a woman's voice from somewhere in the bowels of the suite. "Send them back." The 3 of them stood in a narrow entryway. To the right was an ajar door that led to a bathroom. Straight ahead, Amber could make out a sliver of a living room. Gesturing grandly, Renly said,
"Please make your way down the hallway and then a right. Miss Graham is waiting."
Betty and Amber shared a confounded expression, then headed for the living room. Much like the exterior of the Manx, the color scheme of the room was a mixture of black, sandy brown, and creamy white. The living area boasted a large couch covered in throw pillows and 2 oversized chairs on either end of the elegant cherrywood coffee table before the couch. A TV sat dormant on a credenza. The living room gave way to the bedroom, without a wall bisecting the large space. Darby sat propped up against the headboard, hunkered down beneath the fluffy cream-colored bedspread. The area around her, and one of the 2 black nightstands flanking the bed, were covered in the flotsam of her wedding plans. A schedule book lay open on her lap. No one else was in the room. Though Darby looked alert and bright-eyed, angry red welts coated her neck, dotted her face, and had turned one of her ears an itchy-looking pink. Amber suspected there were more welts below her long-sleeved shirt. Amber felt itchy just looking at her, so she diverted her eyes.
"Oh, Betty, I'm so glad you came. I hope you know I never blamed you for this," Darby said.
When Amber glanced up at her, she had a splotchy hand extended toward Betty. The pair ambled over to the bed, and Betty grabbed hold of Darby's outstretched palm.
"I wanted to be the one to tell you," Darby said. "We got the results back. The Holts paid for a food analysis on the cupcake wedge. They went all out and paid for an immunochemical assay, a test that uses antibodies to detect specific allergic proteins. They also used my blood, urine, hair, and a nasal swab to conduct a chemical toxicological investigation. My medical records already make it very clear that I have a known allergy to walnuts, so they ran all their tests to figure out what other allergen caused all this." She gestured to her face. "There are 8 major ones in the U.S., and I've been tested for most of them. Things like eggs, wheat, and soy. Sesame is likely to be added to that list soon, making it 9 major food allergens. I've always known I'm allergic to it, but it's not one I talk about as much as walnuts." Amber pumped a fist in the air, proud of herself and Aunt G for their deduction skills. So it was sesame? Darby eyed Amber curiously. Betty's mind was clearly elsewhere. She didn't even notice Amber's odd behavior. "I don't understand. I don't even have sesame oil in my shop. I don't use it." "Their best guess," Darby said, "is that the oil was injected into the cupcakes. We found out that your shop had been broken into, so we assumed that's when the cupcakes were compromised. I feel awful that all of this happened to you because of me, Betty." Betty dismissively waved this away, but Amber could tell Betty appreciated the sentiment. "You're the one who got poisoned." It was Darby's turn to wave a dismissive hand. With no clear suspects in the break-in of Betty's shop, Betty or Bobby were likely still the ones at the top of the suspect list of who could have added the oil to the cupcakes, either by accident or with ill intent.
Amber guessed Darby telling the police and her family that she didn't suspect Betty of foul play would help to an extent. But even if there was no evidence to prove Betty was guilty, there also wasn't any to prove she was innocent. Amber took a tiny step forward. "Do you think someone was trying to kill you, Darby? Who would even know you're allergic to sesame oil?" Darby's calm composure, despite her off-putting appearance, faltered. "I've been trying to figure that out myself. Sesame is easy enough for me to avoid. No tahini, no breads with sesame seeds on them. Though with the walnut allergy, I usually avoid most bread entirely anyway, as all tree nuts have the potential to set me off. There are a lot of Asian dishes I can't have, unfortunately, but the sesame allergy doesn't come up that often. Walnuts are harder to avoid. They're sometimes present in random things, like sweets and soft cheeses. Most people who know me well know all this, but I don't know who I've specifically told about sesame. My mind has been fuzzy. I think it's from all the meds they pumped into me. I haven't been sleeping that well either." "That I can relate to," Betty said. Betty and Darby discussed their favorite at-home remedies for insomnia, but Amber wasn't listening. Her mind had spiraled back to the spell she'd used on Melanie's body to reveal her most recent memory. She could easily alter the words of that spell on the fly. As always, it was less about the specific words Amber used to give structure to the spell, but her intention behind it. If her intention wasn't pure, the spell was sure to fail, no matter what words she used. With contact, Amber could get a glimpse of Darby's last memory associated with sesame. The problem with memory retrieval spells, however, was that they couldn't be controlled. Amber supposed if she practiced enough, she could train her magic to root around in a person's memories, like a burglar rifling through a sock drawer, searching for the specific memory she wanted. But invasive mind magic wasn't something Amber was skilled at, nor did she want to be. Most of what she knew was self-taught, and the learning curve was steep. Sometimes she felt as if she were still a teenager, navigating a change in both hormones and fluctuating powers. Like an impulsive teenager, she'd made some questionable choices as far as magic use went in the last month. She was trying to do better. She wanted to be the kind of witch who helped others, but it was hard to judge when her brand of help tipped toward intrusive. A peek at a buried memory, especially if it could ease some of Darby's fears about who'd tried to hurt her, and if it could help clear Betty of any wrongdoing, seemed okay, didn't it? Amber knew one risk of the spell was that what it revealed could be something as mundane as Darby ordering a meal somewhere and asking about the sesame content. Even so, she mentally cast the spell, then followed it with her intention for the magic. "I want to know if someone in Darby's inner circle would use this knowledge against her, both for her sake and Betty's." Her magic thrummed happily in her veins, sensing Amber's pure intention. Gently placing her hand on Darby's and startling her out of her conversation with Betty, Amber infused her tone with as much concern as she could when she asked, "Did you discuss sesame seeds or oil with your caterer for the wedding? Was anyone from your family or wedding party there?" Darby said, her gaze going a little glassy as she thought back. Amber's vision went white for a moment. Then a crystal-clear scene snapped into place in her mind's eye. She was in one of Darby's memories. She couldn't see Darby herself, but she could see part of her torso. The long black braid hung over one shoulder, and her arms, notably devoid of itchy welts. The sleeves of her shirt hit her just past her elbows. Darby was seated at a round table, covered by a white cloth, and surrounded by 3 other diners, 1 female, 2 male. Amber didn't recognize either of the men. Both were in their late 20s to early 30s, clean-shaven, and wore crisp dress shirts. Amber guessed that they wore pressed slacks and expensive shoes. The woman across from Darby was undoubtedly Robin, the best friend and maid of honor. Darby's left ring finger was unadorned, so this must have been from a time before Darby and Nigel had gotten engaged. White porcelain plates were topped with bright pink salmon, steaks, or, in Darby's case, a dish that looked like creamed butternut squash topped with sausage pieces and caramelized onions drizzled with the dark sauce. A flickering candle sat in the middle of the table, ensconced in an elegant glass holder and flanked by small flower arrangements dominated by red roses. Had this been a fancy double date? Nothing particular of note happened during the meal, and Amber couldn't hear what anyone was saying, probably because the memory was so far back, Darby didn't remember what had been discussed, just that the dinner had happened. At some point, Darby began to scratch at her neck and the area around her inner elbows. A few welts popped up on her forearm. She pressed a hand to her chest, the silk blouse beneath her palm rising and falling too quickly. The face of the man to her right swung into her direct line of sight, his brows smashed together. Amber thought he might have mouthed, "Need medicine?" Darby must have said yes, because she slowly turned her head and watched as the man fished around in Darby's purse hanging from the back of her chair. He took out a tube that looked like a chunky ballpoint pen. One end had a blue cap, the other an orange tip. EpiPen was stamped in thick black letters on a yellow background. He handed it to her. This man wasn't as adept at dealing with Darby's allergies as Robin was. With practiced efficiency, Darby jabbed the pen into her own thigh. Amber abruptly pulled out of the memory then, stumbling back a step and breaking her contact with Darby's hand. She had no idea how much time had passed while she'd been reliving the memory. It had felt like minutes, but given that Darby only looked mildly confused, Amber figured it hadn't been long. "Did you hear me, Amber?" Darby asked, head cocked. "No, sorry," Amber said, willing her heart rate to slow. "What did you say?" "It's weird. As soon as you touched me, I suddenly remembered something. I was out at dinner, and it was the first time I realized I needed to be more diligent about not ordering certain foods or asking for no sauce," Darby said. "About 4 years ago, I had an allergic reaction to a sausage dish. Some sausages have sesame in them. And it was a double whammy because there was a sauce with Japanese sesame salt in it. I didn't go into full anaphylaxis, thankfully. My reaction to sesame is less intense than my reaction to walnuts, but it makes me break out in hives, as you can see. Sesame is in some really random things, and I've gotten surprised a few times over the years. It's hard needing to check the labels of everything I eat, or being that pain-in-the-butt person at restaurants who has to ask about ingredients. The hives from sesame always seem to crop up on my face." "Bad timing for a wedding," Amber said. "Between you and me," Darby said, eyeing Amber and Betty in turn, "I'd be more than happy to have my makeup artist do her magic and just cover this mess up with concealer. But Candace wants me to wait until the welt's clear so it doesn't ruin the pictures. They paid a lot of money for some fancy celebrity photographer, and I need to be at my best," she sighed. "I just want to marry Nigel and get the heck out of Dodge for our honeymoon already." "Is he still snowed in?" Betty asked. Darby brightened. "He got in last night. He's out running around with Candace right now, shelling out extra money to several places as an apology for shoving the date back. He's also making sure we still have the venue and that the caterers are still on board." She smiled broadly at Betty. "You're still on board, right? You're the best baker in this whole town." "Of course," Betty said. "But how are you so sure I didn't do anything to those cupcakes when everyone else seems to think I did?" "For one, I know a good egg when I meet one. 2, she flushed, her rosy cheeks matching the welts on her neck and the shell of one ear. "Candace weaseled some information out of one of the cops about the search of your shop. I'm guessing there were threats made by a family lawyer, and someone caved to get her to back off. It was probably Lysander. That man could make the guards outside Buckingham Palace crack. Anyway, there wasn't a single bottle of sesame oil found in your shop, in the dumpsters out back, or in your house. Plus, they pulled a partial print off the cord on your freezer that had been cut. They haven't gotten the results back on who it belongs to, but it wasn't yours or your husband's. That's proof enough that someone vandalized your shop and sabotaged those cupcakes. So yes, of course I want you to bake my wedding cupcakes if you still want the job." "I do," Betty said, then laughed. "Now it sounds like us who are getting married." Darby grinned. "If you can remake all those cupcakes in the next 2 days, I will totally marry you." Betty winced.
2 days, huh? I'll pay double what I already offered, Darby said quickly.
Tone a little shaky, Betty asked,
And you still want the fondant flowers and figurines?
Yes, please, Darby said, smiling with too many teeth. Amber said, Oh, I get it. The in-person meeting here in your hotel room while you're covered in welts was to help soften the blow of the quick turnaround time?
I am desperate.
And if seeing me look like this sways people, I have no shame in using my itchy, puffy self to elicit guilt, Darby said. Did I mention I was almost murdered? Amber and Betty barked laughs. Wow, Amber said. You're good. Betty blew out a sigh.
You're lucky I like you, Darby.
She sat up in bed. You'll do it?
I'll do it.
Darby scrambled onto her knees, her scheduling book getting trampled in the process, and threw her arms around Betty's neck. You're the best! Betty returned the hug, lightly patting Darby's back. When they broke the embrace and Darby got resettled in the bed, Betty added,
Double, right?
I'll have Candace cut a check as soon as she gets back. It'll be delivered to the shop by tomorrow morning, Darby said. I'll email you tonight with my final choices on the flavors, too.
Guess I better get baking.
They were just getting ready to leave when Amber remembered something. Oh, I have a gift for you, Darby. Rooting around in her purse still strapped across her chest, she pulled out a box. From that, she plucked a plastic platypus. Darby clapped her hands like a little kid. Oh, it's adorable! This is Bill, Amber said, placing the toy on the schedule book in Darby's lap. He's got voice activation discs in his body. The commands he knows are walk, shake, speak, and sleep. Just say his name followed by the command word. Biting her bottom lip, Darby stared at the dormant, duck-billed platypus. While she was distracted, presumably deciding which command to try first, Amber cast a quick activation spell, discreetly swiping a hand through the air as the final touch. Bill, shake, Darby said. All at once, the rigidity of the animal melted away, as if it were a tiny live mammal rather than a plastic one. It angled its beak downward, bent its front flippered legs as if it were a dog in play stance, and then gave its flat beaver-like tail a waggle. Darby's eyes lit up. This is amazing! Staring at Amber for a beat, she asked, I'm guessing hiring you to make 150 of these things in 2 days would be impossible? Amber had magic on her side, and not even she could pull that off. Not even for triple the fee. Dang it. Well, my niece will love this. Assuming I give it to her. Maybe I'll just give her a pair of socks. Amber and Betty waved goodbye and headed for the door. Renly, the butler, had just opened the door for them when Amber heard, Bill, speak, followed by a series of chirps and rumbly grunts. Darby's delighted laugh escorted them out. Chapter 7. After climbing back into her car, Betty just sat there, staring into space.
I think my stress-induced ulcer might be coming back. That vandal destroyed my inventory. All my fondant work was smashed. I'll have to order more of everything. It might not even get here in time, unless I take a trip out to Portland to get supplies. But that will eat up half my day. I suppose I could...
I have an idea, Amber said, cutting her off. But you might not like it. Betty turned more fully in her seat to eye Amber.
Sugar, you know I think you're a wonderful human being, but I tasted one of your baking attempts many moons ago. It had a lot to be desired.
First of all, I'm deeply offended, Amber said, though she wasn't. Even when she was baking cupcakes with a box mix, she managed to screw them up. Second, what do you think about recruiting the help of Kathy Mulgrew? She braced herself.
The horrible woman who has been poking and prodding at my insecurities for weeks? That Kathy Mulgrew?
Yes, Amber tried. You said yourself that she's a master at fondant. I was just in her shop a few days ago. She's incredibly talented. If she could make all the fondant flowers and bows and whatever Darby wants, you could focus on making the cakes and frosting." Betty pursed her lips. "Darby just said she's paying you double. You could pay Kathy without it cutting into the amount you already planned to receive," Amber said. "She's very mean," Betty muttered. "She's not the best," Amber agreed, remembering how freely Kathy had lied about how she'd lost the job to Betty. "But she's also going through a rough patch, so she could probably use the money." Betty muttered something under her breath. "I'm only suggesting it to help save your sanity," Amber said. "I'd have to check with Darby first." Amber mentally cheered. Assuming Kathy was gracious about being offered the job and that the two women didn't butt heads too much, they should be able to get it all done in time. If Darby says okay, and Kathy isn't a toad when we present this idea to her, it'll save you a lot of grief. But if she is a toad, she's also a toad in a cast. I can kick her in her good shin for you, and she won't be able to chase us down to retaliate." Laughing, Betty said, "I don't know many people who would offer to inflict bodily harm on others for me." "What can I say? I'm selfless." "You just want to earn more coconut cream delights, don't you?" Betty asked, brow cocked. Amber shrugged. "I should be up to a free baker's dozen by now." At the end of the following day, Kathy of Cat's Treats was officially on board with helping Betty get the Graham Holt cupcakes done on time. Betty said the woman had sobbed hysterically over the phone when she offered her the gig, and Kathy had apologized profusely for being a buffoon and a sore loser. She'd even negotiated her rate down from what Betty offered, as she felt so bad about how she'd treated Betty. The impending arrival of her first grandchild had turned Kathy into a high-strung mess, as the pregnancy had been high risk. Once it was clear her daughter was okay, and the baby, though in the NICU, was going to be okay too, Kathy realized she'd become a terror to many people in her life. Breaking her ankle had only made her sour disposition even more sour. From what Amber had heard from Betty, who got secondhand information from Darby and Garcia, and Kim, who got secondhand information from half the Edgehill population, the identity of the vandal and cupcake saboteur was still unknown. The partial fingerprint had yielded no matches, as the perpetrator had neither a past criminal history nor a job that had required fingerprinting. A match could only be made in the APHIS system if the vandal's fingerprint had already been cataloged. The town was abuzz with activity, thanks to the upcoming Graham Holt wedding. Hotels, restaurants, and shops were getting an uptick in business as attendees of the wedding swarmed the town. Normally, Edgehill was rather deserted this time of year, so it was nice to get a flurry of visitors. The weather had remained dreary for weeks, but the wedding was to take place indoors. Currently, it was just after midnight, and Amber sat perched on her bench seat, staring out her rain-streaked window. She'd been roused from another dream about Melanie. This had been a sad one, reminding Amber that her life was a little dimmer now that Melanie was no longer in it. In the dream, Amber, Kim, and Melanie had been all dolled up for a wedding, dancing the night away at the reception. Amber had alternated between dancing with Connor Declan, the reporter from the Edgehill Gazette, and Jack Terrence, the co-owner of the Percolate coffee shop. Melanie kept telling her to choose Jack. She'd been so persistent about it, holding onto Amber's elbows and staring deep into her eyes. When she said Jack was the one for her, it had woken Amber up. It almost felt as if Melanie really had been talking to her, that her spirit had invaded her dream to impart a message. Waking in her dark, quiet apartment had filled Amber with a bone-deep sadness that stripped her of her ability to sleep. So she left the cats on the bed and curled up on the bench seat instead. It was while she sat there, with rain pelting her window, that she saw something across the street. A flash of white light near the ground. She sat up straighter, gaze wildly scanning the rain-soaked scene. Another flash. The sweep of a flashlight beam? It was coming from the side of Purrfectly Scrumptious. Was the vandal back, ready to destroy the cupcakes again on the eve of Darby's wedding? She scrambled off the bench seat in search of her grimoire. She found it lying on her coffee table, surrounded by bits and pieces of half-constructed toys. Furiously flipping through it, she found a clarity spell. Carting the book back to the bench seat, She cast the spell, then rubbed her hand in a circle on the cold glass of her window. A clear spot, as if she'd cut a hole in the glass, materialized. No rain marred the circle, giving Amber a clear view of Betty's shop below. Someone was definitely down there. Oh, no, you don't. In record time, Amber changed back into jeans, a hoodie, and boots. She grabbed her charging cell phone off her nightstand, her keys off the dining room table, and yanked on her raincoat as she ran down the steps. She wasn't sure what she planned to do, but she couldn't let whoever this was get away with burglarizing Betty's shop again. As she stood at the locked door of her shop, she dialed the local police station. A tired-sounding man answered. "Hi, this is Amber Blackwood. I live on Russian Blue Avenue. Someone is trying to break into Betty Harris's shop across the street."
Oh, goodness, again?
He asked, sounding decidedly more awake now.
I'll put a call out to whoever I can.
Thanks. She hung up, flipped her jacket hood over her head, and darted out her door into the rain. Amber didn't think about the intelligence of this plan until she'd made it across the street and was slipping her emergency key into the lock on the door of Betty's shop. She might have been a witch, but it wasn't as if she was skilled at combat magic. If the vandal had a weapon, Amber was toast, especially if she startled the person. Thankfully, Betty's door didn't have a jangling bell above it like Amber's did. What little sound the well-oiled hinges made was drowned out by the relentless wind and rain falling in sideways sheets behind her.
I'm all alone in the rain.
Amber froze.
I'm all alone in the pain.
She figured out 4 things in quick succession. 1, the person had already gotten inside. 2, it was a man's voice and was coming from the back of the shop. 3, he was drunk or close to it. 4, he was a horrendous singer.
Return and give me back my smile. Come take away my face. Hold me close now. Nighttime is so mean.
This was punctuated by a sob. Oh dear. She crept toward the swinging door that led to the kitchen in the back. There was a small plastic window in the door, so she stayed low to avoid being seen through it. As she stood beside the door, out of range of the window, she pressed her ear to it. The man was still singing to himself. He must have hit the chorus of whatever heartbreak ballad he thought he was belting out, because he was focused on that far more than anything else. She imagined him with his eyes closed, an open bottle of Jack Daniels held in his fist by the neck, and his head thrown back as he serenaded the ceiling. Steeling herself, she peeked through the plastic window. She'd been spot on in her guess, though he was holding the neck of what appeared to be a jumbo bottle of cheap vodka. Oof. He was also soaked, his Hawaiian shirt sticking to his skin, and his wet hair plastered to his head. He had a thick beard that covered half his face, and rainwater dripped off the end. She didn't know this man, but something about his appearance sparked a note of recognition anyway. With his head thrown back in song, he was in a similar position to how she'd last seen him, sleeping in a chair in the lounge of the Manx Hotel as the Golf Channel played. Only, she guessed now that he hadn't been asleep. He'd been hanging out at the scene of his impending crime. To... what? Be present when Darby was wheeled out in a body bag after ingesting too much sesame oil? She recalled something Betty had said. I was starting to think she sent someone else in her place, actually. A bearded man I've never seen before has been in here several times this week during peak busy hours, and only buys something occasionally. But he stopped coming in a few days ago, too. I'm probably just paranoid now. Had this man been scoping out the bakery before he broke in? She realized then that he was also the bearded man who had been loitering outside her shop the day she'd called Aunt G about food allergens. The man had been shouting that Edgehill was the worst because so many businesses closed early, and then he'd stalked down the sidewalk, paper bag-wrapped alcoholic drink clutched in his hand. Amber was still watching him when his hauntingly emotional, truly atrocious ballad ended. He leveled his stare at the larger of the cupcake freezers. It was about twice the size of a home refrigerator, had only one door, and was outfitted with shelves of various heights. Amber knew it wasn't specifically a cupcake freezer, but a commercial freezer that had been outfitted and adjusted to best keep cakes fresh. Through its glass door, Amber spotted the larger cake on the upper shelf that would be the top of the cupcake tower, with the smaller cakes placed in wire, concentric rings that grew in diameter the farther they got from the top. Dozens and dozens of cupcakes lined the lower shelves. The man adjusted his hold on the vodka bottle, and with a steely expression etched on his face, he strode forward. "Freeze!" Amber hadn't realized she was going to act until she did. Now she was standing in the kitchen with a very drunk, very sad man. She grabbed a makeshift weapon from the nearest table and held it aloft. It was a rolling pin, at least, and not something decidedly less threatening, like a whisk. "Ah!" the man shrieked, throwing his hands into the air. The vodka bottle slipped from his hand and shattered on the ground, instantly filling Amber's nostrils with the pungent scent of alcohol. "Who are you?" she shouted. "What are you doing here?" His bottom lip trembled. "Are you a cop?" Amber glanced down at herself. She hadn't zipped up her raincoat before she'd run out into the elements, so part of her hoodie was visible. It featured the top half of a cat's face, looking quite alarmed. Below it read, "Don't go outside, people are out there." She couldn't imagine she looked remotely like a member of law enforcement, but that bottle of cheap booze had been half empty before it had hit the ground, so there was no telling what kind of mental state this man was in. "No, but they're on their way," Amber said. The man moaned pitifully, and Amber worried he was going to run out the ajar back door. It flapped lightly in the wind. The oaf had kicked it in again. Bits of leaves littered the doorway and rainwater splattered the mat just inside the door. Instead, what he did was worse. He let out a battle cry and charged at her. She froze for only a moment, her frightened gaze locked with his wild one. "Sleep!" The man's eyes rolled back in his head, and he tumbled toward her like a sack of potatoes. They went down in a heap, thankfully avoiding the alcohol, broken glass, and concussions from colliding with furniture or walls. She had the wind knocked out of her, though, and she dropped the rolling pin with a clatter. When spots no longer danced in her vision, she wiggled out from under the man. He wasn't a huge guy, maybe 5'8" or 9" and slim. Still, he was heavy. They'd crashed into the swinging traffic door, leaving the man's prone body lying half in the main part of the bakery and half in the alcohol-scented kitchen. She rolled him onto his back as he'd landed face first when he'd fallen. Amber propped herself up against the wall nearby and heaved out a breath. Her heart raced. Running over here hadn't been the smartest call. Even though she knew she couldn't have saved Melanie, there would always be lingering guilt that if she'd done this, that, or this differently, her friend would still be here. The feeling that Melanie had been there in her dream, both urging her to pursue Jack and indirectly waking her up, had filled Amber with a desperate need to do all she could now to help Betty, as if Melanie had reached out from the grave and given her a hard shake. The man on the floor offered a snort but remained asleep. Amber had perfected sleep spells at a young age. As a teenage witch with an oftentimes annoying younger sister, putting each other to sleep had become a favorite pastime in the Blackwood household. Letting a sleep spell run its course was best. Waking someone prematurely often resulted in the person waking up swinging and disoriented. Seeing as the man was drunk as a skunk, he would probably be passed out for even longer. She sighed. The police could deal with him. She didn't know if Edgehill had a drunk tank, but hopefully they had a suitable place to let the guy dry out, in multiple ways, and prevent him from targeting Betty's shop again. "Ah!" Amber scrambled sideways on her backside as the drunk man lurched straight up in a sitting position like Frankenstein's monster on the operating table. Had the excessive alcohol consumption negated her sleep spell? Her rolling pin was too far away, otherwise she would have clubbed him over the head to knock him out again. When he stopped wailing, he pressed his hands to his head. "What happened?" Amber figured she could throw another sleep spell at him if he aggressively lunged for her. It would give her enough time to get out of here at least. If she ran now, he'd likely give chase. In a calm tone that belied her thundering heartbeat, she said, "You broke into a bakery, and now we're waiting for the police." He dropped his hands and swung his wide gaze at her as if she were an alien who had just beamed into the room. "You made me go night-night." Aunt G's admonitions replayed in her head. "Your magic almost got you into trouble with the police chief last week," she had said. "That trouble may still come to pass."
If you're going to meddle in this on Betty's behalf, at least be smart about it."
Amber figured it was best not to mention this little incident to her aunt. Plus, this guy was so out of it, no one would believe him anyway, right? She had to hope this was a blackout kind of drunk. Bad for the guy's liver, but good for Amber and her secret. She'd already blown her cover with him, so why not double down? Quickly cataloging the spells she'd used recently, she recalled the simple truth spell she'd used on Chief Brown. It was a spell that could only elicit a yes or no answer, and often only worked on a person once in a 24-hour period. And given the guy's inebriation level, it might not work at all. Lunging forward, with the spell freshly cast in her mind, she wrapped a hand around his wrist and asked, "Did you inject sesame oil into the cupcakes?" The man choked back a sob.
"Yes."
Bewildered, Amber sat back again, hard. A rolling cart topped with heavy-duty mixers and shelves lined in metal bowls was behind her. The cart's contents rattled softly as her shoulder bumped into it. "Why? Why did you try to kill Darby?" He gasped.
"I didn't try to kill her. I love her."
He shook his head.
"Love her. I just wanted to make her think twice. She's making a mistake."
He hinged forward abruptly and cocked his head at her.
"Have you ever been in love, Magic Lady? It makes you do some very wacky things."
He burst into raucous sobs. The crying was alarming in its own right, if only because he sounded like a yowling cat in heat. But she realized something else, too. While this man had a full beard that covered half his face, and his hair was a wild mess, this was the same clean-shaven man she'd seen in Darby's memory. He'd just swung his face toward her the same way he'd done with Darby. It was the man who had fished the EpiPen out of her purse when she'd eaten a dish that had hidden amounts of sesame in it. "You dated her before Nigel," Amber said, fitting the pieces together.
"She's making a mistake,"
he wailed. "So you tried to kill her because if you can't have her, no one can?" His crying stopped on a dime. His eyes were red-rimmed, and tears had tracked into his beard. He jutted a finger at her.
"No. No. Take it back."
Amber held her hands up in innocence. "Why don't you tell me why you did it then?"
"Sesame doesn't affect her as bad as walnuts. It just makes her get hives. I think she's beautiful even when she's puffy,"
he said, staring at Amber earnestly, as if he wanted her to praise him for thinking Darby was still pretty even in the throes of an allergic reaction. Amber said nothing.
"I put the oil in all of them because I knew she had a taste test coming up."
"How'd you even know that? Why are you in Edgehill at all?" Amber asked, finding it hard to believe Darby had invited this guy to her wedding. "What's your name, by the way?"
"Ian,"
he said, but didn't ask hers, so she didn't supply it. The less he could potentially remember about her come morning, the better.
"I've been in town for a week, just scoping things out, looking for my opportunity, but I could never catch Darby alone."
"Couldn't you just call her?" Amber asked. Ian stuck out his bottom lip.
"We used to talk a lot, stayed friends even though we broke up. But after she got together with Nigel, suddenly she didn't have time to talk to me anymore. She'd get upset with me if I talked too much about our past. Said she thought it was better if I moved on. I couldn't move on. I still love her. She can't love Nigel. What kind of name is Nigel Holt, anyway? She's just with him for his money. It's made her blind to what she really wants. He's changed her."
Amber didn't know what to say to any of this.
"Since she's shallow now, I knew getting welts all over her face would postpone the wedding until they cleared up,"
Ian said.
"I figured I could get in to see her at the hospital. Seeing me would remind her. An in-person conversation would be better than over the phone. She didn't block me, but she usually sends my calls to voicemail now. She couldn't send me to voicemail in person. I just needed her to hear me. She wasn't just my girlfriend, she was my best friend. I lost that when she started dating Nigel. I miss her, and she can't be bothered to care because she's a hospitality princess now.
Some part of Amber felt bad for the guy. He looked so miserable. But poisoning someone to make her talk to you was extreme. Not to mention destroying Betty's inventory and her property. The guy needed help. The saddest part was that Amber guessed Nigel hadn't changed Darby that much. Ian had chosen sesame oil because he thought she was too shallow to have a wedding while covered in welts. But she'd told Amber and Betty that she'd be more than happy to have my makeup artist do her magic and just cover this mess up with concealer. It was Candace, Nigel's mother, who had wanted the wedding postponed for aesthetic reasons. Maybe Darby had tried to stay friends with Ian, but had cut him off when she saw staying connected to him was hurting him more than helping. The back door banged open, and in dashed Garcia and Carl. Amber flinched hard, knocking a metal mixing bowl off the cart behind her. "Ah!" Ian yelped, scrambled to his feet, and slammed through the swinging kitchen door. Amber was impressed the man could move so fast while soused.
"Fancy meeting you here, Miss Blackwood," Carl said in passing as he leaped over the broken vodka bottle, through the swinging door, and tackled Ian before he could escape. By the time Carl got Ian to his feet, he was weeping again. The guy was going to have one heck of a hangover in the morning. Amber stood and peered out the plastic window in the swinging door. Carl frog-marched Ian through the still unlocked front door. The rain had slowed some, but the shoulders of Carl's raincoat had turned a darker shade of blue. She wondered how long Carl and Garcia had been out there before they'd come in the back. She turned to find Garcia watching her. He cocked a brow. "You showing up at crime scenes is becoming a habit."
She winced, then told him how she'd seen someone creeping around the bakery with a flashlight.
"He could have been armed, Amber."
"I know. I wasn't thinking. I just didn't want Betty to have to deal with another break-in. It was stupid." Garcia sighed, then jutted his head toward the front door.
"Any idea who that guy is?"
Amber perked up, glad she could at least tell the officer what she'd found out about Ian. After recounting what she'd learned, she added, "I saw him in the lounge of the Manx the day Darby was almost killed. He was also day drinking outside my shop one day after closing, complaining loudly about my hours, and I think Betty saw him in here a few times before the break-in, too." Garcia nodded absently.
"I don't think even Darby has any idea he's in town. In our many talks, and the many, many talks with her mother and mother-in-law, no one has mentioned a volatile ex."
"Ian didn't come up in the search when that partial fingerprint from the cord was found?" Amber asked. Garcia opened his mouth, closed it.
"I'd ask how you even know about that already, but this is Edgehill. I'm not going to fully answer that. Let's just say running a fingerprint check doesn't automatically mean there will be a hit."
He paused, thoughtful.
"I guess it's lucky he came back. He could have slipped out of town, and we would have had a heck of a time tracking him down."
"So I helped?" Amber asked brightly. Garcia pursed his lips.
"What you did was get lucky that guy didn't have a gun on him. Next time, call us and then wait for us to get here, okay? I understand Betty is your friend, but it's our job to handle these things, not yours."
This was the most Garcia had ever said to her in one conversation. He had a nice, rumbly voice. He'd properly chastised her without yelling. Hearing someone's disappointment was always worse than hearing anger anyway. "Got it. Sorry." Her brain still refused to believe he had a wicked falsetto. He said,
"I'm glad you're not hurt. We'll get her back door patched up, and we'll follow up with you if we have more questions."
"I have a question for you, Garcia." He eyed her dubiously. "What's your favorite karaoke song?" The seconds ticked by with agonizing slowness. The cloying scent of cheap vodka burned her nostrils.
"Hey There, Lonely Girl" by Eddie Holman. If you tell anyone that, I'll have you arrested.
Garcia frowned.
"Carl talks too much."
She squealed internally at this juicy piece of information. But since Garcia looked vaguely murderous, she took that as her cue to leave. The storm had broken by the time she stepped back outside. She stood on the curb, staring up at the scudding clouds. A patch of inky black sky dotted with a few stars stretched out above her, though, reminding her of the clarity spell she'd cast on her window.
"Everything all right, Miss Blackwood?"
She glanced over to find Carl strolling over from where he'd left the squad car a few feet away. Amber could make out the slightly swaying head of Ian in the back seat. Perhaps he was drunkenly serenading himself again. "Yeah," Amber said, offering Carl a smile. "I think everything is just fine." Epilogue. Amber wasn't sure how word had spread so fast that she'd had a hand in figuring out that Ian Shaw was the Purrfectly Scrumptious vandal and the one who had almost killed Darby Graham. She highly doubted Garcia had blabbed to anyone, and Carl, as goofy as he was good at his job. Amber surmised Betty played a role in the fast-spreading rumor. In any case, it had landed Amber and Betty a coveted invite to the wedding. Darby had called and personally invited Amber, so it would have been hard for her to find an excuse to stay home. Plus, Betty was so appreciative that Amber had risked her safety to save another batch of Betty's cupcakes. Betty wouldn't have let her stay home anyway. Dragging Amber to community events had been one of Betty's pastimes for years, after all. There was no way she'd let Amber miss the event of the year, aside from the Here and Meow, of course. Darby had granted them both a +1, which Candace Holt was no doubt furious about, throwing off the carefully arranged seating plan. When Amber called Kim to ask her to be her date, her friend screamed so loud in excitement that Amber had dropped her phone. The wedding was gorgeous. The couple was deliriously happy, and Betty's cupcakes were a hit. Snatches of conversations Amber eavesdropped on, the skinny from Betty and Kim, and even information from Darby herself had filled out the rest of the picture on the nature of Darby and Ian's doomed relationship. The couple had been high school sweethearts who had broken up their first year in college when they realized the long-distance thing wasn't working. They'd made a pact that if they were both still single when they graduated, they'd reconsider trying again. Darby and Robin, while in college in New York, ended up at a swanky party purely by chance. Darby met Nigel that night, and as Robin said during her maid of honor speech, Darby had declared that she'd just met the man she was going to marry. 3 years later, that prediction came true. Unfortunately for Ian, though, he'd held on to the hope that he and Darby would start up where they'd left off in college. He hadn't taken the news well, and while he hadn't started outright harassing and stalking Darby, he'd gotten close. Nigel had caught Ian on security cameras outside their house at least twice over the years. When Ian got the news that Darby and Nigel were engaged, he'd vanished from Darby's life for a while. Darby had thought that was the end of it, that Ian had accepted he and Darby weren't meant to be. Instead, Ian had been plotting ways to sabotage the wedding and win her back. Amber hoped that when Ian sobered up, he'd realize how his obsession with his supposed best friend had gotten so out of hand, and he'd get help. He might have tried to only get her sick, but he'd almost killed her. If it hadn't been for Robin's quick actions, he might have. Since the Graham and Holt matriarchs were both a lot, Amber had worried they'd commandeered too much of the wedding to make it into what they'd wanted. She half expected the reception to be rigid and formal. Instead, a half hour into it, the matriarchs were both tipsy and dancing their tails off. Trudy Graham even apologized to Betty for accusing her of harming her daughter. Kim finally dragged Amber out onto the dance floor after nearly an hour. They laughed as they watched Bobby and Betty. Betty wasn't a terrible dancer, but Bobby was atrocious. He did it with such zealous abandon, though, that it swung back into the good category, but not by much. When a slow song came on, Bobby swept Amber out to the middle of the dance floor, while Betty and Kim partnered up. He quietly thanked Amber for taking care of Betty all week. "You're like my grandparents," Amber had said. "Family."
"Family,"
he agreed.
"But am I really grandpa-aged? Can't I be the cool uncle?"
When the song switched to the Cupid Shuffle, he backed away from her, joining the substantial group forming. As he launched into the dance with everyone else, he called out, "Could a grandpa do this?" Betty and Kim flanked Amber just off the dance floor. Betty whispered, "I'm not sure anyone should do that." As she and Kim laughed, Amber thought she caught a whiff of Melanie's favorite perfume. She scanned the area around her, as if she could see her ghost lingering nearby. Amber had never seen a ghost before, so she wasn't sure why she thought she'd start now. Still, it felt like Melanie was there with her. I miss you too, Amber thought. She looped her arms through Kim's and Betty's, watching Bobby cut a rug. While Amber's social circle wasn't huge, it was growing. There had been a lot of grief in her life, but she liked to think she was getting a little better at handling it. Isolation had always been a defense mechanism, but she missed out on so much that way. When she awoke the next morning, she did so naturally, without a nightmare rousing her with a start. The knot of grief in her chest had loosened a fraction. Her phone chimed, and she rolled over to grab it off the nightstand. Tom, who had been stretched out like pulled taffy by her side, issued a croaky meow of protest, but didn't otherwise move. Allie, who was curled up on the pillow by Amber's head, hadn't stirred. A text message from Betty had come in. I'm experimenting with a new cupcake flavor. Want to be my test subject? Amber smiled. It was going to be a good day. This has been Pawsitively Sabotaged, Book 1.5 in the Witch of Edgehill series, written by Melissa Erin Jackson, narrated by Victoria Villarreal. Copyright 2023 by Melissa Erin Jackson. If you'd like to learn who killed Amber's friend Melanie, you can find Pawsitively Poisonous on your favorite retailer.